Gods of the North by Robert E. Howard. Across the red drifts and mail-clad forms, two figures glared at each other. In that utter desolation, only they moved. The frosty sky was over them, the white illimitable plain around them, the dead men at their feet. Slowly through the corpses they came, as ghosts might come to a tryst through the shambles of a dead world. In the brooding silence, they stood face to face. Both were tall men, built like tigers. Their shields were gone, their corselets battered and dinted, blood dried on their mail, their swords were stained red. Their horned helmets showed the marks of fierce strokes. One was beardless and black-maned. The locks and beard of the other were red as the blood on the sunlit snow. "Man," said he, "tell me your name so that my brothers in Vanaheim may know who was the last of Wulfhere's band to fall before the sword of Heimdall." "Not in Vanaheim," growled the black-haired warrior. "But in Valhalla you will tell your brothers that you met Conan of Cimmeria." Heimdall roared and leaped, and his sword flashed in deathly arc. Conan staggered, and his vision was filled with red sparks as the singing blade crashed on his helmet, shivering into bits of blue fire. But as he reeled, he thrust with all his power of his broad shoulders behind the humming blade. The sharp point tore through brass scales and bones and heart, and the red-haired warrior died at Conan's feet. The Cimmerian stood upright, trailing his sword, a sudden sick weariness assailing him. The glare of the sun on the snow cut his eyes like a knife, and the sky seemed shrunken and strangely apart. He turned away from the trampled expanse where yellow-bearded warriors lay locked with red-haired slayers in the embrace of death. A few steps he took, and the glare of the snowfields was suddenly dimmed. A rushing wave of blindness engulfed him, and he sank down into the snow, supporting himself on one mailed arm, seeking to shake the blindness out of his eyes as a lion might shake his mane. A silvery laugh cut through his dizziness, and his sight cleared slowly. He looked up. There was a strangeness about all the landscape that he could not place or define, an unfamiliar tinge to earth and sky. But he did not think long of this. Before him, swaying like a sapling in the wind, stood a woman. Her body was like ivory to his dazed gaze, and save for a light veil of gossamer, she was naked as the day. Her slender bare feet were whiter than the snow they spurned. She laughed down at the bewildered warrior. Her laughter was sweeter than the rippling of silvery fountains, and poisonous with cruel mockery. "Who are you?" asked the Cimmerian. "Whence you come?" "What matter?" Her voice was more musical than a silver-stringed harp, but it was edged with cruelty. "Call up your men," said he, grasping his sword. "Yet though my strength fail me, they shall not take me alive. I see that you are of the Vanir." "Have I said so?" His gaze went again to her unruly locks, which at first glance he had thought to be red. Now he saw that they were neither red nor yellow, but a glorious compound of both colors. He gazed spellbound. Her hair was like elfin gold. The sun struck it so dazzlingly that he could scarcely bear to look upon it. Her eyes were likewise neither wholly blue nor wholly gray, but of shifting colors and dancing lights and clouds of colors he could not define. Her full red lips smiled, and from her slender feet to the blinding crown of her billowy hair, her ivory body was as perfect as the dream of a god. Conan's pulse hammered in his temples. "I cannot tell," said he, "whether you are of Vanaheim and mine enemy, or of Asgard and my friend. Far have I wandered, but a woman like you I have never seen. Your locks blind me with their brightness. Never have I seen such hair, not even among the fairest daughters of the Aesir. By Ymir." "Who are you to swear by Ymir?" she mocked. "What know you of the gods of ice and snow, you who have come up from the south to adventure among an alien people?" "By the dark gods of my own race," he cried in anger. Though I am not of the golden-haired Aesir, none has been more forward in sword-play. This day I have seen 80 men fall, and I alone have survived the field where Wulfhere's reavers met the wolves of Bragi. Tell me, woman, have you seen the flash of mail out across the snow plains, or seen armed men moving upon the ice?" "I have seen the hoarfrost glittering in the sun," she answered. "I have heard the wind whispering across the everlasting snows." He shook his head with a sigh. "Niord should have come up with us before the battle joined. I fear he and his fighting men have been ambushed. Wulfhere and his warriors lie dead. I had thought there was no village within many leagues of this spot, for the war carried us far, but you cannot have come a great distance over these snows, naked as you are. Lead me to your tribe if you are of Asgard, for I am faint with blows and the weariness of strife." "My village is further than you can walk, Conan of Cimmeria," she laughed. Spreading her arms wide, she swayed before him, her golden head lolling sensuously, her scintillant eyes half shadowed beneath their long silken lashes. "Am I not beautiful, O man?" "Like dawn running naked on the snows," he muttered, his eyes burning like those of a wolf. "Then why do you not rise and follow me? Who is the strong warrior who falls down before me?" she chanted in maddening mockery. "Lie down and die in the snow with the other fools. Conan of the black hair, you cannot follow where I would lead." With an oath the Cimmerian heaved himself up on his feet, his blue eyes blazing, his dark, scarred face contorted. Rage shook his soul, but desire for the taunting figure before him hammered at his temples and drove his wild blood fiercely through his veins. Passion fierce as physical agony flooded his whole being, so that earth and sky swam red to his dizzy gaze. In the madness that swept upon him, weariness and faintness were swept away. He spoke no word as he drove at her, fingers spread to grip her soft flesh. With a shriek of laughter she leaped back and ran, laughing at him over her white shoulder. With a low growl Conan followed. He had forgotten the fight, forgotten the mailed warriors who lay in their blood, forgotten Niord and the reavers who had failed to reach the fight. He had thought only for the slender white shape which seemed to float rather than run before him. Out across the white blinding plain the chase led. The trampled red field fell out of sight behind him, but still Conan kept on with the silent tenacity of his race. His mailed feet broke through the frozen crust. He sank deep in the drifts and forged through them by sheer strength. But the girl danced across the snow light as a feather floating across a pool. Her naked feet barely left their imprint on the hoarfrost that overlaid the crust. In spite of the fire in his veins, the cold bit through warrior's mail and fur-lined tunic, but the girl in her gossamer veil ran as lightly, as gaily as if she danced through the palm and rose gardens of Poitain. On and on she led, and Conan followed. Black curses drooled through the Cimmerian's parched lips. The great veins in his temples swelled and throbbed, and his teeth gnashed. "You cannot escape me," he roared. "Lead me into a trap, and I'll pile the heads of your kinsmen at your feet. Hide from me, and I'll tear apart the mountains to find you. I'll follow you to hell." Her maddening laughter floated back to him, and foam flew from the barbarian's lips. Further and further into the wastes she led him. The land changed. The wide plains gave way to low hills marching upward in broken ranges. Far to the north he caught a glimpse of towering mountains, blue with the distance, or white with the eternal snows. Above these mountains shone the flaring rays of the Borealis. They spread fanwise into the sky, frosty blades of cold, flaming light, changing in color, growing and brightening. Above him the skies glowed and crackled with strange lights and gleams. The snow shone weirdly, now frosty blue, now icy crimson, now cold silver. Through a shimmering icy realm of enchantment Conan plunged doggedly onward in a crystalline maze where the only reality was the white body dancing across the glittering snow beyond his reach, ever beyond his reach. He did not wonder at the strangeness of it all, not even when two gigantic figures rose up to bar his way. The scales of their mail were white with hoarfrost, their helmets and their axes were covered with ice. Snow sprinkled their locks. In their beards were spikes of icicles. Their eyes were cold as the lights that streamed above them. "Brothers!" cried the girl, dancing between them. "Look who follows! I have brought you a man to slay. Take his heart that we may lay it smoking on our father's board." The giants answered with roars like the grinding of icebergs on a frozen shore, and heaved up their shining axes as the maddening Cimmerian hurled himself upon them. A frosty blade flashed before his eyes, blinding him with its brightness, and he gave back a terrible stroke that sheared through his foe's thigh. With a groan the victim fell, and at the instant Conan was dashed into the snow, his left shoulder numb from the blow of the survivor from which the Cimmerian's mail had barely saved his life. Conan saw the remaining giant looming high above him, like a colossus carved of ice, etched against the cold, glowing sky. The axe fell, to sink through the snow and deep into the frozen earth as Conan hurled himself aside and leaped to his feet. The giant roared and wrenched his axe free, but even as he did, Conan's sword sang down. The giant's knees bent, and he sank slowly into the snow, which turned crimson with the blood that gushed from his half-severed neck. Conan wheeled to see the girl standing a short distance away, staring at him in wide-eyed horror, all the mockery gone from her face. He cried out fiercely, and the blood drops flew from his sword as his hand shook in the intensity of his passion. "Call the rest of your brothers," he cried. "I'll give their hearts to the wolves. You cannot escape me." With a cry of fright she turned and ran fleetly. She did not laugh now, nor mock him over her white shoulder. She ran as for her life, and though he strained every nerve and thew until his temples were like to burst and the snow swam red to his gaze, she drew away from him, dwindling in the witch-fire of the skies, until she was a figure no bigger than a child, then a dancing white flame on the snow, then a dim blur in the distance. But grinding his teeth until the blood started from his gums, he reeled on, and he saw the blur grow to a dancing white flame, and the flame to a figure big as a child, and then she was running less than 100 paces ahead of him, and slowly the space narrowed, foot by foot. She was running with effort now, her golden locks blowing free. He heard the quick panting of her breath, and saw a flash of fear in the look she cast over her white shoulder. The grim endurance of the barbarian had served him well. The speed ebbed from her flashing white legs. She reeled in her gait. In his untamed soul leaped up the fires of hell she had fanned so well. With an inhuman roar he closed in on her just as she wheeled with a haunting cry and flung out her arms to fend him off. His sword fell into the snow as he crushed her to him. Her lithe body bent backward as she fought with desperate frenzy in his iron arms. Her golden hair blew about his face, blinding him with its sheen. The feel of her slender body twisting in his mailed arms drove him to blinder madness. His strong fingers sank deep into her smooth flesh, and that flesh was cold as ice. It was as if he embraced not a woman of human flesh and blood, but a woman of flaming ice. She writhed her golden head aside, striving to avoid the fierce kisses that bruised her red lips. "You are cold as the snows," he mumbled dazedly. "I will warm you with the fire in my own blood." With a scream and a desperate wrench, she slipped from his arms, leaving her single gossamer garment in his grasp. She sprang back and faced him, her golden locks in wild disarray, her white bosom heaving, her beautiful eyes blazing with terror. For an instant he stood frozen, awed by her terrible beauty as she posed naked against the snows. And in that instant she flung her arms toward the lights that glowed in the skies above her, and cried out in a voice that rang in Conan's ears forever after. "Ymir! Oh, my father, save me!" Conan was leaping forward, arms spread to seize her, when, with a crack like the breaking of an ice mountain, the whole skies leaped into icy fire. The girl's ivory body was suddenly enveloped in a cold blue flame so blinding that the Cimmerian threw up his hands to shield his eyes from the intolerable blaze. A fleeting instant, skies and snowy hills were bathed in crackling white flames, blue darts of icy light and frozen crimson fires. Then Conan staggered and cried out. The girl was gone. The glowing snow lay empty and bare. High above his head the witch-lights flashed and played in a frosty sky gone mad, and among the distant blue mountains there sounded a rolling thunder as of a gigantic war-chariot rushing behind steeds, whose frantic hooves struck lightning from the snows and echoes from the skies. Then suddenly the Borealis, the snow-clad hills, and the blazing heavens reeled drunkenly to Conan's sight. Thousands of fireballs burst with showers of sparks, and the sky itself became a titanic wheel which rained stars as it spun. Under his feet the snowy hills heaved up like a wave, and the Cimmerian crumpled into the snows to lie motionless. In a cold, dark universe whose sun was extinguished eons ago, Conan felt the movement of life, alien and unguessed. An earthquake had him in its grip, and was shaking him to and fro, at the same time chafing his hands and feet until he yelled in pain and fury and groped for his sword. "He's coming to, Horsa," said a voice. "Haste! We must rub the frost out of his limbs if he's ever to wield sword again." "He won't open his left hand," growled another. "He's clutching something." Conan opened his eyes and stared into the bearded faces that bent over him. He was surrounded by tall, golden-haired warriors in mail and furs. "Conan, you live!" "By Crom Niord!" gasped the Cimmerian. "Am I alive, or are we all dead and in Valhalla?" "We live," grunted the Aesir, busy over Conan's half-frozen feet. "We had to fight our way through an ambush, or we had come up with you before the battle was joined. The corpses were scarce cold when we came upon the field. We did not find you among the dead, so we followed your spoor. In Ymir's name, Conan, why did you wander off into the wastes of the north? We have followed your tracks in the snow for hours. Had a blizzard come up and hidden them, we had never found you by Ymir." "Swear not so often by Ymir," uneasily muttered a warrior, glancing at the distant mountains. "This is his land, and the god abides among yonder mountains, the legends say." "I saw a woman," Conan answered hazily. "We met at Bragi's men in the plains. I know not how long we fought. I alone lived. I was dizzy and faint. The land lay like a dream before me. Only now do all things seem natural and familiar. The woman came and taunted me. She was beautiful as a frozen flame from hell. A strange madness fell upon me when I looked at her, so I forgot all else in the world. I followed her. Did you not find her tracks, or the giants in icy mail I slew?" Niord shook his head. "We found only your tracks in the snow, Conan." "Then it may be I am mad," said Conan dazedly. "Yet you yourself are no more real to me than was the golden-locked witch who fled naked across the snows before me. Yet from under my very hands she vanished in icy flame." "He is delirious," whispered a warrior. "Not so," cried an older man, whose eyes were wild and weird. "It was Atali, the daughter of Ymir, the frost giant. To fields of the dead she comes, and shows herself to the dying. Myself, when a boy, I saw her, when I lay half slain on the bloody field of Wolfshead. I saw her walk among the dead in the snows, her naked body gleaming like ivory, and her golden hair unbearably bright in the moonlight. I lay and howled like a dying dog because I could not crawl after her. She lures men from stricken fields into the wastelands to be slain by her brothers, the ice giants, who lay men's red hearts smoking on Ymir's board. The Cimmerian has seen Atali, the frost giant's daughter." "Bah!" grunted Horsa. Old Grom's mind was touched in his youth by a sword cut to the head. Conan was delirious from the fury of battle. Look how his helmet is dinted. Any of these blows might have addled his brain. It was an hallucination he followed into the wastes. He is from the south. What does he know of Atali? You speak truth, perhaps, muttered Conan. It was all strange and weird by Crom. He broke off, glaring at the object that still dangled from his clenched left fist. The others gaped silently at the veil he held up, a wisp of gossamer that was never spun by human distaff. End of Gods of the North by Robert E. Howard.
Halt, who goes there? A Mystery Story by Robert E. Howard. Prologue. A blazing sun blazed out of a blazing sky and blazed down blazingly on a blazing expanse of blazing barren sand in a blazing desert. Naught was to be except sand dunes, and yet, a long caravan of camels emerged from behind a sand dune and meandered along the ancient desert trail, which was ancient beyond the memory of man. It was even said that the trail had been made even before William Jennings Bryan began to run for president. The Tuareg chieftain looked about him with a sneer on his handsome face. With contempt he gazed at the sand dunes. Somehow he felt superior to them. Presently the caravan stopped by an ancient city, half hidden beneath the sands of the desert. It was almost in ruins, a very ancient city. It had been deserted long before Congress began to discuss the immigration problem even. The Tuareg dismounted from his camel and entered his tent. A slave girl offered him a chaw of beechnut from her own private plug. He kicked her with a harsh tone of voice. Seating himself on an expensive divan from Bokhara, he reflected meditatively. "Darn it," he soliloquized. Chapter 1. Aha! $1 million, mused the colonel.
"Exactly, my dear colonel,"
returned Hawkshaw, the great detective, wittily. "But the details of the crime?"
"As follows," Hawkshaw replied. "The night watchman of the Stocksocoli Bank, London, was knocked unconscious, and $1 million in American thrift stamps, as well as £1 million of sterling and a box of fine cigars were taken."
"The villain!" exclaimed the colonel indignantly. "And cigars as expensive as they are." "How are you going to go about finding the guilty person?" asked the colonel.
"In the following manner," answered Hawkshaw. "Let us first begin by deduction. Let us say, for example, that 3 persons could have robbed the bank. You, I, or the Khedive of Egypt. Now it is impossible that you could commit the robbery, because at the time the robbery was committed you were playing a foursome of tiddlywinks with the Duke of Buckingham."
"That's true, but how did you know?" exclaimed the colonel.
"My dear colonel," answered Hawkshaw, "I saw the crumbs on your opera hat. Now, as for myself, I could not have done the robbery because I was in a theatre in Drury Lane. I almost distinctly remember the play, even. It was called The Storekeeper of Venice, and it was written by a fellow named Shakespeare or something, who was a native of Algeria. Then consider the Khedive of Egypt. He could not have committed the robbery because he was on his sugar moon, his molasses moon, with his 999th sextillion 999 quintillion 999 trillion 999 billion 999 million 999,999th wife, hunting social lions, lounge lizards, zebras, and other big game in the wilds of Schenectady, New York. And having eliminated myself, you and the Khedive, do you see what this points to?"
"No,"
the colonel answered. "It indicates the robbery was done by someone else," said Hawkshaw dramatically.
"Indeed!"
exclaimed the colonel in admiration.
"Aha! Wonderful!"
"I shall now," Hawkshaw continued, "go into the street and arrest everyone I meet. To each I shall put the question, did you rob the Stocksocoli Bank, or did you not? And I shall be governed by their answers."
Chapter 2. The Anarchist.
"Curses!" hissed Alisiki. "Grugi goofa gimma moffa swift sky kif skaviska chinka sky thirty reva bishki." Curses, Alachitsky, etc., hissed again, even more hissier than before. This nation of Egypt shall fall, or my name is not Aski Mojimp, giving the correct pronunciation of the name, Alachitsky, etc. The anarchist, with great stealth, then placed a bomb under a girl's school. There, he hissed. That be a defeat to the accused bourgeois. After going several blocks, he stopped with an enraged look in his coat pocket. 10 billion imprecations, he hissed. I forgot to light the fuse. He walked on through London. Presently, the anarchist came to a palatial mansion in the slums, which was the clubhouse of all the anarchists in that part of London. He walked up to the door and rang the old-fashioned door-knocker. Give the password, hissed a voice from within. The wages of sin are a mansion on Riverside Drive, answered the anarchist. The door swung open, and he entered. There were several members of the anarchist club in the club-room, engaged in anarchist pastimes such as swigging ginger ale, playing marbles for keeps, growing whiskers, and cussing the bourgeoisie. Feeling in a reckless mood, Alachitsky spent a nickel for ginger ale and offered to bet 3 cents either way on the next Olympic Games. One of the club members, Heine von Schloof, then made a speech. Was is, he began eloquently, was is the nation going to do even the cost of hog iron? I mean, pig iron has gone up 2 cents on the yard already, yet. And what is so many Irisher loafers getting jobs when white men like me can't yet? I have met an Irisher on the street, and I say, get out of mine way, you no good bunt. And look at the black eye, what he gives me. They say that Irish are such good fighters. Bah! That makes me tired feel. Why over to Gretchen's wedding, that drunken old hooligan come in and try to raise it. A rough house, and me and my cousin, Abi, and Ludwig and Hans, and 4 or 5 others. Why we pretty near threw that Irishman right out of the house. I will never go to Ireland. The anarchists applauded, and then Alachitsky proposed a toast. Down with everything! Long live Lindman and Lepesky, and hurrah for Russia! Chapter 3. Britannia rules the waves. As Alachitsky the anarchist walked down Piccadilly Circus, he glanced about, hoping to see a bank that he could rob. As he came into another street, 2 men accosted him, one a tall, thin man, the other a short, stocky man. "Aha!" said Hawkshaw, for it was he. "Methinks you unshaven Russian, with the cannibalistic face, has the guilty look of a first-class criminal." The detective stopped Alachitsky. "Wait a moment, my friend. Pause while I gaze upon your unhandsome visage, and ask you a question or 3 or 4. "What do you want?" asked Alachitsky, having swiftly selected a fiendish sneer from his extensive collection of mocking smiles, derisive leers, glares, dirty looks, unholy mirth, chuckles, diabolical stares, etc. "Did you rob the Stocksacale Bank?" asked Hackshaw. "No," answered Alachitsky. "Darn it," said the colonel, baffled again. "Hold on," said Hackshaw. "My Russian friend, you are under arrest." The Russian was seized by policemen and Scotland Yard detectives. "Britannia rules the waves," said Mr. Hawkshaw. "Another triumph for Scotland Yard." He addressed Alachitsky. "I knew you were telling a falsehood because, when you denied robbing the bank, you raised an eyebrow and wiggled your toes. Also, I had suspicions of you when you asked the inspector of Scotland Yard if they found a set of burglars' tools in the Stocksacale Bank. You said they were yours, and if they were found, to deliver them to the anarchist clubhouse. I delivered them myself, disguised as a rear admiral of the Swiss army. Then, when I saw the $1 million banknotes and thrift stamps in your vest pocket, I took a chance and arrested you." "Curses!" cursed Alachitsky. "The way you robbed the bank was in the following manner," said Hawkshaw. "You came into the bank, disguised as a king of the South Sea Islands. You climbed up the fire escape and down one of the marble pillars of the bank front. Then, having taken an impression of the keyhole with wax, you filled out a key to fit, from a cigar made in Dusseldorf, Germany. Then you entered and robbed the bank. Is that correct?" "No. The watchman has left the door open, and I went up the bank steps and walked in," answered the Russian.
Epilogue. The Eskimo floundered through the deep snow and kicked an iceberg out his way. Reaching his igloo, he unharnessed his team of whales from his sled and entered the igloo. Snow covered the land, yards deep. Here and there mighty icebergs reared up toward the sky, for it was midsummer in northern Alaska. End of Halt! Who Goes There? A Mystery Story by Robert E. Howard.
In the Forest of Villefère by Robert E. Howard. The sun had set. The great shadows came striding over the forest. In the weird twilight of a late summer day, I saw the path ahead glide on among the mighty trees and disappear. And I shuddered and glanced fearfully over my shoulder. Miles behind lay the nearest village. Miles ahead, the next. I looked to left and right as I strode on, and anon I looked behind me. And anon I stopped short, grasping my rapier, as a breaking twig betokened the going of some small beast. Or was it a beast? But the path led on, and I followed, because, forsooth, I had naught else to do. As I went, I bethought myself. My own thoughts will rout me if I am not aware. What is there in this forest, except perhaps the creatures that roam it, deer and the like? Tush, the foolish legends of those villagers. And so I went, and the twilight faded into dusk. Stars began to blink, and the leaves of the trees murmured in the faint breeze. And then I stopped short, my sword leaping to my hand, for just ahead, around a curve in the path, someone was singing. The words I could not distinguish, but the accent was strange, almost barbaric. I stepped behind a great tree, and the cold sweat beaded my forehead. Then the singer came in sight, a tall, thin man, vague in the twilight. I shrugged my shoulders. A man I did not fear. I sprang out, my point raised. "Stand!" He showed no surprise. "I prithee, handle thy blade with care, friend," he said. Somewhat ashamed, I lowered my sword. "I am new to this forest," I quoth, apologetically. "I hear talk of bandits. I crave pardon. Where lies the road to Villefère?" "Corbleu, you've missed it," he answered. "You should have branched off to the right some distance back. I'm going there myself. If you may abide my company, I will direct you." I hesitated. Yet, why should I hesitate? "Why, certainly, my name is Monteur de Normandy, and I am Carlos de Loup." "No!" I started back. He looked at me in astonishment. "Pardon," I said, "the name is strange. Does not Loup mean wolf?" "My family were always great hunters," he answered. He did not offer his hand. "You will pardon my staring," said I as we walked down the path, "but I can hardly see your face in the dusk." I sensed that he was laughing, though he made no sound. "It is little to look upon," he answered. I stepped closer, then leapt away, my hair bristling. "A mask!" I exclaimed. "Why do you wear a mask, monsieur?" "It is a vow," he explained. "In fleeing a pack of hounds, I vowed that if I escaped, I would wear a mask for a certain time." "Hounds, monsieur?" "Wolves," he answered quickly. I said wolves. We walked in silence for a while, and then my companion said, I am surprised that you walk these woods at night. Few people come this way, even in the day. I am in haste to reach the border, I answered. A treaty has been signed with the English, and the Duke of Burgundy should know of it. The people at the village sought to dissuade me. They spoke of a wolf that is purported to roam these woods. Here the path branches to Villefère, said he, and I saw a narrow, crooked path that I had not seen when I passed it before. It led in among the darkness of the trees. I shuddered. Do you wish to return to the village? No, I exclaimed. No, no, lead on. So narrow was the path that we walked single file, he leading. I looked well at him. He was taller, much taller than I, and thin, wiry. He was dressed in a costume that smacked of Spain. A long rapier swung at his hip. He walked with long, easy strides, noiselessly. Then he began to talk of travel and adventure. He spoke of many lands and seas he had seen, and many strange things. So we talked and went further and further into the forest. I presumed that he was French, yet he had a very strange accent that was neither French nor Spanish nor English, nor like any language I had ever heard. Some words he slurred strangely, and some he could not pronounce at all. This path is not often used, is it? I asked. Not by many, he answered, and laughed silently. I shuddered. It was very dark, and the leaves whispered together among the branches. A fiend haunts this forest, I said. So the peasants say, he answered, but I have roamed it oft and never have seen his face. Then he began to speak of strange creatures of darkness, and the moon rose, and shadows glittered among the trees. He looked up at the moon. Haste, he said, we must reach our destination before the moon reaches her zenith. We hurried along the trail. They say, I said, that a werewolf haunts these woodlands. It might be, said he, and we argued much upon the subject. The old women say, said he, that if a werewolf is slain while a wolf, then he is slain. But if he is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. But haste thee, the moon nears her zenith. We came into a small, moonlit glade, and the stranger stopped. Let us pause a while, said he. Nay, let us be gone, I urged. I will not this place. He laughed without sound. Why, said he, this is a fair glade. As good as a banquet hall it is, and many times I have feasted here. Ha, ha, ha! Look ye, I will show you a dance. And he began bounding here and there, anon flinging back his head and laughing silently. Thought I, the man is mad. As he danced his weird dance, I looked about me. The trail went not on, but stopped in the glade. Come, said I, we must on. Do you not smell the rank, hairy smell that hovers about the glade? Wolves' den here. Perhaps they are about us, and are gliding upon us even now. He dropped upon all fours, bounded higher than my head, and came toward me with a strange, slinking motion. That dance is called the Dance of the Wolf, he said, and my hair bristled. Keep off! I stepped back, and with a screech that set the echoes shuddering, he leapt for me, and, though the sword hung at his belt, he did not draw it. My rapier was half out when he grasped my arm and flung me headlong. I dragged him with me, and we struck the ground together. Wrenching a hand free, I jerked off the mask. A shriek of horror broke from my lips. Beast eyes glittered beneath that mask. White fangs flashed in the moonlight. The face was that of a wolf. In an instant, those fangs were at my throat. Taloned hands tore the sword from my grasp. I beat at that horrible face with my clenched fists, but his jaws were fastened on my shoulder. His talons tore at my throat. Then I was on my back. The world was fading. Blindly I struck out. My hand dropped, then closed automatically around the hilt of my dagger, which I had been unable to get at. I drew and stabbed. A terrible, half-bestial bellowing screech. Then I reeled to my feet, free. At my feet lay the werewolf. I stooped, raised the dagger, then paused, looking up. The moon hovered close to her zenith. If I slew the thing as a man, its frightful spirit would haunt me forever. I sat down, waiting. The thing watched me with flaming wolf eyes. The long, wiry limbs seemed to shrink, to crook. Hair seemed to grow upon them. Fearing madness, I snatched up the thing's own sword and hacked it to pieces. Then I flung the sword away and fled. The end of In the Forest of Villefère by Robert Howard.
Queen of the Black Coast by Robert E. Howard. 1. Conan joins the pirates. Believe green buds awaken in the spring, that autumn paints the leaves with somber fire. Believe I held my heart inviolate, to lavish on one man my hot desire. The Song of Belit. Hoofs drummed down the street that sloped to the wharfs. The folk that yelled and scattered had only a fleeting glimpse of a mailed figure on a black stallion, a wide scarlet cloak flowing out on the wind. Far up the street came the shout and clatter of pursuit, but the horseman did not look back. He swept out onto the wharfs and jerked the plunging stallion back on its haunches at the very lip of the pier. Seamen gaped up at him as they stood to the sweep and striped sail of a high-prowed, broad-waisted galley. The master, sturdy and black-bearded, stood in the bows, easing her away from the piles with a boat-hook. He yelled angrily as the horseman sprang from his saddle and with a long leap landed squarely on the mid-deck. "Who invited you aboard?" "Get under way," roared the intruder with a fierce gesture that spattered red drops from his broadsword. "But we're bound for the coast of Kush," expostulated the master. "Then I'm for Kush. Push off, I tell you." The other cast a quick glance up the street, along which a squad of horsemen were galloping. Far behind them toiled a group of archers, crossbows on their shoulders. "Can you pay for your passage?" demanded the master. "I pay my way with steel," roared the man in armor, brandishing the great sword that glittered bluely in the sun. "By crom, man, if you don't get under way, I'll drench this galley in the blood of its crew." The shipmaster was a good judge of men. One glance at the dark, scarred face of the swordsman hardened with passion, and he shouted a quick order, thrusting strongly against the piles. The galley wallowed out into clear water. The oars began to clack rhythmically. Then a puff of wind filled the shimmering sail. The light ship heeled to the gust, then took to her course like a swan, gathering headway as she skimmed along. On the wharfs the riders were shaking their swords and shouting threats and commands that the ship put about, and yelling for the bowmen to hasten before the craft was out of arbalist range. "Let them rave," grinned the swordsman heartily. "Do you keep her on her course, master steersman." The master descended from the small deck between the bows, made his way between the roars of oarsmen, and mounted the middeck. The stranger stood there with his back to the mast, eyes narrowly averted, sword ready. The shipman eyed him steadily, careful not to make any move toward the long knife in his belt. He saw a tall, powerfully built figure in the black scale-mail hauberk, burnished greaves, and a blue steel helmet from which jutted bull's horns highly polished. From the mailed shoulders fell the scarlet cloak, blowing in the sea wind. A broad shagreen belt with a golden buckle held the scabbard of the broadsword he bore. Under the horn helmet, a square-cut black mane contrasted with smoldering blue eyes. "If we must travel together," said the master, "we may as well be at peace with each other. My name is Tito, licensed master shipman of the ports of Argos. I am bound for Kush to trade beads and silks and sugar and and brass-hilted swords to the Black Kings for ivory, copra, copper ore, slaves, and pearls. The swordsman glanced back at the rapidly receding docks, where the figures still gesticulated helplessly, evidently having trouble in finding a boat swift enough to overhaul the fast-sailing galley. "I am Conan, a Cimmerian," he answered. "I came into Argos seeking employment, but with no wars forward, there is nothing to which I might turn my hand." "Why did the guardsmen pursue you?" asked Tito. "Not that it's any of my business, but I thought perhaps—" "I've nothing to conceal," replied the Cimmerian. "By crom, though I've spent considerable time among you civilized people, your ways are still beyond my comprehension. Well, last night in a tavern, a captain in the king's guard offered violence to the sweetheart of a young soldier, who naturally ran him through. But it seems there is some cursed law against killing guardsmen, and the boy and his girl fled away. It was bruited about that I was seen with them, and so today I was haled into court, and a judge asked me where the lad had gone. I replied that since he was a friend of mine, I could not betray him. Then the court waxed wrath, and the judge talked a great deal about my duty to the state and society and other things I did not understand, and bade me tell where my friend had flown. By this time I was becoming wrathful myself, for I had explained my position. But I choked my ire and held my peace, and the judge squalled that I had shown contempt for the court, and that I should be hurled into a dungeon to rot until I betrayed my friend. So then, seeing they were all mad, I drew my sword and cleft the judge's skull. Then I cut my way out of the court, and seeing the high constable's stallion tied nearby, I rode for the wharfs, where I thought to find a ship bound for foreign parts. Well, said Tito heartily, the courts have fleeced me too often in suits with rich merchants for me to owe them any love. I'll have questions to answer if I ever anchor in that port again, but I can prove I acted under compulsion. You may as well put up your sword. We're peaceable sailors and have nothing against you. Besides, it's as well to have a fighting man like yourself on board. Come up to the poop deck and we'll have a tankard of ale. Good enough, readily replied the Cimmerian, sheathing his sword. The Argus was a small, sturdy ship, typical of those trading craft which ply between the ports of Zingara and Argos and the southern coasts, hugging the shoreline and seldom venturing far into the open ocean. It was high of stern, with a tall, curving prow, broad in the waist, sloping beautifully to stem and stern. It was guided by the long sweep from the poop, and propulsion was furnished mainly by the broad striped silk sail, aided by a jibsail. The oars were for use in tacking out of creeks and bays and during calms. There were 10 to the side, 5 fore and 5 aft of the small middeck. The most precious part of the cargo was lashed under this deck and under the foredeck. The men slept on deck or between the rowers' benches, protected in bad weather by canopies. With 20 men at the oars, 3 at the sweep, and the shipmaster, the crew was complete. So the Argus pushed steadily southward, with consistently fair weather. The sun beat down from day to day with fiercer heat, and the canopies were run up, striped silken cloths that matched the shimmering sail and the shining goldwork on the prow and along the gunwales. They sighted the coast of Shem, long rolling meadowlands with the white crowns of the towers of cities in the distance, and horsemen with blue-black beards and hooked noses who sat their steeds along the shore and eyed the galley with suspicion. She did not put in. There was scant profit in trade with the sons of Shem. Nor did Master Tito pull into the broad bay where the Styx River emptied its gigantic flood into the ocean, and the massive black castles of Camille loomed over the blue waters. Ships did not put unasked into this port, where dusky sorcerers wove awful spells in the murk of sacrificial smoke mounting eternally from blood-stained altars where naked women screamed, and where Set, the old serpent, arch-demon of the Hyborians but god of the Stygians, was said to writhe his shining coils among his worshippers. Master Tito gave that dreamy glass-floored bay a wide berth, even when a serpent-proud gondola shot from behind a castellated point of land, and naked, dusky women with great red blossoms in their hair stood and called to his sailors, and posed and postured brazenly. Now no more shining towers rose inland. They had passed the southern shores of Stygia and were cruising along the coasts of Kush. The sea and the ways of the sea were never-ending mysteries to Conan, whose homeland was among the high hills of the northern uplands. The wanderer was of no less interest to the sturdy seamen, few of whom had ever seen one of his race. They were characteristic Argosian sailors, short and stockily built. Conan towered above them, and no 2 of them could match his strength. They were hardy and robust, but his was the endurance and vitality of a wolf, his thews steeled and his nerves whetted by the hardness of his life in the world's wastelands. He was quick to laugh, quick and terrible in his wrath. He was a valiant trencherman, and strong drink was a passion and a weakness with him. Naive as a child in many ways, unfamiliar with the sophistry of civilization, he was naturally intelligent, jealous of his rights, and dangerous as a hungry tiger. Young in years, he was hardened in warfare and wandering, and his sojourns in many lands were evident in his apparel. His horned helmet was such as worn by the golden-haired Aesir of Nordheim. His hauberk and greaves were of the finest workmanship of Koth. The fine ring-mail which sheathed his arms and legs was of Nemedia. The blade at his girdle was a great Aquilonian broadsword, and his gorgeous scarlet cloak could have been spun nowhere but in Ophir. So they beat southward, and Master Tito began to look for the high-walled villages of the black people. But they found only smoking ruins on the shore of a bay, littered with naked black bodies. Tito swore. "I had good trade here 4 times. This is the work of pirates. And if we meet them?" Conan loosened his great blade in its scabbard. "Mine is no warship. We run, not fight. Yet if it came to a pinch, we have beaten off reivers before, and might do so again, unless it were Belit's tigress." Who is Belit? "The wildest she-devil unhanged. Unless I read the signs wrong, it was her butchers who destroyed that village on the bay. May I some day see her dangling from the yardarm. She is called the Queen of the Black Coast. She is a Shemite woman who leads black raiders. They harry the shipping and have sent many a good tradesman to the bottom." From under the poop deck, Tito brought out quilted jerkins, steel caps, bows and arrows. "Little use to resist if we're run down," he grunted, "but it rasps the soul to give up life without a struggle." It was just at sunrise when the lookout shouted a warning. Along the long point of an island off the starboard bow glided a long, lethal shape, a slender serpentine galley with a raised deck that ran from stem to stern. 40 oars on each side drove her swiftly through the water, and the low rail swarmed with naked blacks that chanted and clashed spears and oval shields. From the masthead floated a long crimson pennon. "Belit!" yelled Tito, paling. "Yare, put her about, into that creek mouth. If we can beach her before they run us down, we have a chance to escape with our lives." So, veering sharply, the Argus ran for the line of surf that boomed along the palm-fringed shore, Tito striding back and forth, exhorting the panting rowers to greater efforts. The master's black beard bristled, his eyes glared. "Give me a bow," requested Conan. "It is not my idea of a manly weapon, but I learned archery among the Hyrcanians, and it will go hard if I can't feather a man or so on yonder deck." Standing on the poop, he watched the serpent-like ship skimming lightly over the waters, and landsman though he was, it was evident to him that the Argus would never win that race. Already arrows, arching from the pirate's deck, were falling with a hiss into the sea not 20 paces astern. "We'd best stand to it," growled the Cimmerian, "else we'll all die with shafts in our backs and not a blow dealt." "Bend to it, dogs!" roared Tito with a passionate gesture of his brawny fist. The bearded rowers grunted, heaved at the oars, while their muscles coiled and knotted, and sweat started out on their hides. The timbers of the stout little galley creaked and groaned as the men fairly ripped her through the water. The wind had fallen. The sail hung limp. Nearer crept the inexorable raiders, and they were still a good mile from the surf when one of the steersmen fell, gagging across a sweep, a long arrow through his neck. Tito sprang to take his place, and Conan, bracing his feet wide on the heaving poop deck, lifted his bow. He could see the details of the pirate plainly now. The rowers were protected by a line of raised mantelets along the sides, but the warriors dancing on the narrow deck were in full view. These were painted and plumed and mostly naked, brandishing spears and spotted shields. On the raised platform in the bows stood a slim figure whose white skin glistened in dazzling contrast to the glossy ebon hides about it. Belit, without a doubt. Conan drew the shaft to his ear. Then some whim or qualm stayed his hand, and sent the arrow through the body of a tall, plumed spearman beside her. Hand over hand, the pirate galley was overhauling the lighter ship. Arrows fell in a rain about the Argus, and men cried out. All the steersmen were down, pin-cushioned, and Tito was handling the massive sweep alone, gasping black curses, his braced legs knots of straining thews. Then with a sob he sank down, a long shaft quivering in his sturdy heart. The Argus lost headway and rolled in the swell. The men shouted in confusion, and Conan took command in characteristic fashion. "Up, lads!" he roared, loosing with a vicious twang of cord. "Grab your steel and give these dogs a few knocks before they cut our throats. Useless to bend your backs any more. They'll board us ere we can row another 50 paces." In desperation, the sailors abandoned their oars and snatched up their weapons. It was valiant, but useless. They had time for one flight of arrows before the pirate was upon them. With no one at the sweep, the Argus rolled broadside, and the steel-baked prow of the raider crashed into her amidships. Grappling irons crunched into the side. From the lofty gunwales, the black pirates drove down a volley of shafts that tore through the quilted jackets of the doomed sailormen, then sprang down, spear in hand, to complete the slaughter. On the deck of the pirate lay half a dozen bodies, in earnest of Conan's archery. The fight on the Argus was short and bloody. The stocky sailors, no match for the tall barbarians, were cut down to a man. Elsewhere the battle had taken a peculiar turn. Conan, on the high-pitched poop, was on a level with the pirate's deck. As the steel prow slashed into the Argus, he braced himself and kept his feet under the shock, casting away his bow. A tall corsair, bounding over the rail, was met in mid-air by the Cimmerian's great sword, which sheared him cleanly through the torso, so that his body fell one way and his legs another. Then with a burst of fury that left a heap of mangled corpses along the gunwales, Conan was over the rail and on the deck of the Tigris. In an instant he was the center of a hurricane of stabbing spears and lashing clubs, but he moved in a blinding blur of steel. Spears bent on his armor or swished empty air, and his sword sang its death song. The fighting madness of his race was upon him, and with a red mist of unreasoning fury wavering before his blazing eyes, he cleft skulls, smashed breast, severed limbs, ripped out entrails, and littered the deck like a shambles with a ghastly harvest of brains and blood. Invulnerable in his armor, his back against the mast, he heaped mangled corpses at his feet until his enemies gave back, panting, in rage and fear. Then, as they lifted their spears to cast them, and he tensed himself to leap and die in the midst of them, a shrill cry froze the lifted arms. They stood like statues, the black giants poised for the spear casts, the mailed swordsman with his dripping blade. Belit sprang before the blacks, beating down their spears. She turned toward Conan, her bosom heaving, her eyes flashing. Fierce fingers of wonder caught at his heart. She was slender, yet formed like a goddess, at once lithe and voluptuous. Her only garment was a broad silken girdle. Her white ivory limbs and the ivory globes of her breast drove a beat of fierce passion through the Cimmerian's pulse, even in the panting fury of battle. Her rich black hair, black as a Stygian night, fell in rippling, burnished clusters down her supple back. Her dark eyes burned on the Cimmerian. She was untamed as a desert wind, supple and dangerous as a she-panther. She came close to him, heedless of his great blade dripping with blood of her warriors. Her supple thigh brushed against it, so close she came to the tall warrior. Her red lips parted as she stared up into his somber, menacing eyes. "Who are you?" she demanded. "By Ishtar, I have never seen your like, though I have ranged the sea from the coasts of Zingara to the fires of the ultimate south. Whence come you?" "From Argus," he answered shortly, alert for treachery. Let her slim hand move toward the jeweled dagger in her girdle, and a buffet of his open hand would stretch her senseless on the deck. Yet in his heart he did not fear. He had held too many women, civilized or barbaric, in his iron-thewed arms, not to recognize the light that burned in the eyes of this one. "You are no soft HYBORIAN," she exclaimed. "You are fierce and hard as a grey wolf. Those eyes were never dimmed by city lights. Those thews were never softened by life amid marble walls." "I am Conan, a Cimmerian," he answered. To the people of the exotic climes, the north was a mazy, half-mythical realm, peopled with ferocious blue-eyed giants who occasionally descended from their icy fastnesses with torch and sword. Their raids had never taken them as far south as Shem, and this daughter of Shem made no distinction between Aesir, Vanir, or Cimmerian. With the unerring instinct of the elemental feminine, she knew she had found her lover, and his race meant naught, save as it invested him with the glamour of far lands. "And I am Belit," she cried, as one might say, "I am queen. Look at me, Conan." She threw wide her arms. "I am Belit, queen of the Black Coast. O tiger of the north, you are cold as the snowy mountains which bred you. Take me and crush me with your fierce love. Go with me to the ends of the earth and the ends of the sea. I am a queen by fire and steel and slaughter. Be thou my king." His eyes swept the blood-stained ranks, seeking expressions of wrath or jealousy. He saw none. The fury was gone from their ebon faces. He realized that to these men, Belit was more than a woman, a goddess whose will was unquestioned. He glanced at the Argus, wallowing in the crimson sea-wash, heeling far over, her decks awash, held up by the grappling irons. He glanced at the blue-fringed shore, at the far green hazes of the ocean, at the vibrant figure which stood before him, and his barbaric soul stirred within him. To quest these shining blue realms with that white-skinned young tiger-cat, to love, laugh, wander, and pillage. "I'll sail with you," he grunted, shaking the red drops from his blade. "Honyaga!" her voice twanged like a bowstring. "Fetch herbs and dress your master's wounds. The rest of you, aboard the plunder and cast off." As Conan sat with his back against the poop rail, while the old shaman attended to the cuts on his hands and limbs, the cargo of the ill-fated Argus was quickly shifted aboard the Tigris and stored in small cabins below deck. Bodies of the crew and of fallen pirates were cast overboard to the swarming sharks, while wounded blacks were laid in the waist to be bandaged. Then the grappling irons were cast off, and as the Argus sank silently into the blood-flecked waters, the Tigress moved off southward to the rhythmic clack of the oars. As they moved out over the glassy blue deep, Belit came to the poop. Her eyes were burning like those of a she-panther in the dark as she tore off her ornaments, her sandals, and her silken girdle and cast them at his feet. Rising on tiptoe, arms stretched upward, a quivering line of naked white, she cried to the desperate horde, "Wolves of the blue sea, behold ye now the dance, the mating dance of Belit, whose fathers were kings of Ascalon." And she danced, like the spin of a desert whirlwind, like the leaping of a quenchless flame, like the urge of creation and the urge of death. Her white feet spurned the blood-stained deck, and dying men forgot death as they gazed frozen at her. Then, as the white stars glimmered through the blue velvet dusk, making her whirling body a blur of ivory fire, with a wild cry she threw herself at Conan's feet, and the blind flood of the Cimmerian's desire swept all else away as he crushed her panting form against the black plates of his corsleted breast. 2. The Black Lotus. In that dead citadel of crumbling stone, her eyes were snared by that unholy sheen, and curious madness took me by the throat, as of a rival lover thrust between. The Song of Belit. The Tigress ranged the sea, and the black villages shuddered. Tom-toms beat in the night with a tale that the she-devil of the sea had found a mate, an iron man whose wrath was that of a wounded lion, and survivors of butchered Stygian ships named Belit with curses, and a white warrior with fierce blue eyes. So the Stygian princes remembered this man, long and long, and their memory was a bitter tree which bore crimson fruit in the years to come. But heedless as a vagrant wind, the Tigress cruised the southern coasts until she anchored at the mouth of a broad southern river whose banks were jungle-clouded walls of mystery. "This is the river Zarkeba, which is death," said Belit. "Its waters are poisonous. See how dark and murky they run? Only venomous reptiles live in that river. The black people shun it. Once a Stygian galley, fleeing from me, fled up the river and vanished. I anchored in this very spot, and days later the galley came floating down the dark waters, its decks blood-stained and deserted. Only one man was aboard, and he was mad and died gibbering. The cargo was intact, but the crew had vanished into silence and mystery. My lover, I believe there is a city somewhere on that river. I have heard tales of giant towers and walls glimpsed afar off by sailors who dared go part way up the river. We fear nothing. Conan, let us go and sack that city." Conan agreed. He generally agreed to her plans. Hers was the mind that directed their raids, his the arm that carried out her ideas. It mattered little to him where they sailed or whom they fought, so long as they sailed and fought. He found the life good. Battle and raid had thinned their crew. Only some 80 spearmen remained, scarcely enough to work the long galley, but Belit would not take the time to make the long cruise southward to the island kingdoms where she recruited her buccaneers. So the Tigress swung into the river mouth. The oarsmen pulled strongly as she breasted the broad current. They rounded the mysterious bend that shut out the sight of the sea, and sunset found them forging steadily against the sluggish flow, avoiding sandbars where strange reptiles coiled. Not even a crocodile did they see, nor any four-legged beast or winged bird coming down to the water's edge to drink. On through the blackness that preceded moonrise they drove, between banks that were solid palisades of darkness, whence came mysterious rustlings and stealthy footfalls and the gleam of grim eyes. And once an inhuman voice was lifted in awful mockery. The cry of an ape, Belit said, adding that the souls of evil men were imprisoned in these man-like animals as punishment for past crimes. But Conan doubted, for once in a gold-barred cage in a Hyrcanian city, he had seen an abysmal, sad-eyed beast which men told him was an ape, and there had been about it naught of the demoniac malevolence which vibrated in the shrieking laughter that echoed from the black jungle. Then the moon rose. A splash of blood, ebony-barred, and the jungle awoke in horrific bedlam to greet it. Roars and howls and yells set the black warriors to trembling, but all this noise, Conan noted, came from farther back in the jungle, as if the beasts, no less than men, shunned the black waters of Zarkeba. Rising above the black denseness of the trees, and above the waving fronds, the moon silvered the river, and their wake became a rippling scintillation of phosphorescent bubbles that widened like a shining road of bursting jewels. The oars dipped into the shining water and came up sheathed in frosty silver. The plumes on the warrior's headpiece nodded in the wind, and the gems on sword hilts and harness sparkled frostily. The cold light struck icy fire from the jewels in Belit's clustered black locks as she stretched her lithe figure on a leopard skin throne on the deck. Supported on her elbows, her chin resting on her slim hands, she gazed up into the face of Conan, who lounged beside her, his black mane stirring in the faint breeze. Belit's eyes were dark jewels burning in the moonlight. "Mystery and terror are about us, Conan, and we glide into the realm of horror and death," she said. "Are you afraid?" A shrug of his mailed shoulders was his only answer. "I am not afraid either," she said meditatively. "I was never afraid. I have looked into the naked fangs of death too often. Conan, do you fear the gods?" "I would not tread on their shadow," answered the barbarian conservatively. "Some gods are strong to harm, others to aid. At least so say their priests. Mitra of the Hyborians must be a strong god because his people have builded their cities over the world. But even the Hyborians fear Set, and Bel, god of thieves, is a good god. When I was a thief in Zamora, I learned of him." "What of your own gods?" "I have never heard you call on them." "Their chief is Crom. He dwells on a great mountain. What use to call on him? Little he cares if men live or die. Better to be silent than to call his attention to you. He will send you dooms, not fortune. He is grim and loveless, but at birth he breathes power to strive and slay into a man's soul. What else shall men ask of the gods?" "But what of the worlds beyond the river of death?" she persisted. "There is no hope here or hereafter in the cult of my people," answered Conan. "In this world men struggle and suffer vainly, finding pleasure only in the bright madness of battle. Dying, their souls enter a grey, misty realm of clouds and icy winds, to wander cheerlessly throughout eternity." Belit shuddered. "Life, bad as it is better than such a destiny. What do you believe, Conan?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I have known many gods. He who denies them is as blind as he who trusts them too deeply. I seek not beyond death. It may be the blackness averred by the Nemedian skeptics, or Crom's land of ice and cloud, or the snowy plains and vaulted halls of the Nordheimers' Valhalla, I know not, nor do I care. Let me live deep while I live. Let me know the rich juices of red meat and stinging wine on my palate, the hot embrace of white arms, the mad exultation of battle when the blue blades flame and crimson. And I am content. Let teachers and priests and philosophers brood over questions of reality and illusion. I know this. If life is illusion, then I am no less an illusion, and being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live. I burn with life. I love. I slay, and am content. But the gods are real, she said, pursuing her own line of thought. And above all are the gods of the Shemites. Ishtar, Ashtoreth, and Darketo, and Adonis. Bel, too, is Shemitish, for he was born in ancient Shumir long, long ago, and went forth laughing, with curled beard and impish wise eyes, to steal the gems of the kings of old times. There is life beyond death, I know, and I know this too, Conan of Cimmeria. She rose lithely to her knees and caught him in a pantherish embrace. My love is stronger than any death. I have lain in your arms, panting with the violence of our love. You have held and crushed and conquered me, drawing my soul to your lips with the fierceness of your bruising kisses. My heart is welded to your heart. My soul is part of your soul. Were I in death and you fighting for life, I would come back from the abyss to aid you. Aye, whether my spirit floated with the purple sails on the crystal sea of paradise, or rifed in the molten flames of hell, I am yours, and all the gods and all their eternities shall not sever us. A scream rang from the lookout in the bows. Thrusting Belit aside, Conan bounded up, his sword a long silver glitter in the moonlight, his hair bristling at what he saw. The black warrior dangled above the deck, supported by what seemed a dark, pliant tree trunk arching over the rail. Then he realized that it was a gigantic serpent which had writhed its glistening length up the side of the bow and gripped the luckless warrior in its jaws. His dripping scales shone leprously in the moonlight as it reared his form high above the deck, while the stricken man screamed and writhed like a mouse in the fangs of a python. Conan rushed into the bows and, swinging his great sword, hewed nearly through the giant trunk, which was thicker than a man's body. Blood drenched the rails as the dying monster swayed far out, still gripping its victim, and sank into the river, coil by coil, lashing the water to bloody foam, in which man and reptile vanished together. Thereafter, Conan kept the lookout watch himself, but no other horror came crawling up from the murky depths, and as dawn whitened over the jungle, he sighted the black fangs of towers jutting up among the trees. He called Belit, who was asleep on the deck, wrapped in his scarlet cloak, and she sprang to his side, eyes blazing. Her lips were parted to call orders to her warriors to take up bows and spears. Then her lovely eyes widened. It was but the ghost of a city on which they looked when they cleared a jutting jungle-clad point and swung in toward the incurving shore. Weeds and rank river grass grew between the stones of broken piers and shattered paves that had once been streets and spacious plazas and broad courts. From all sides except that toward the river, the jungle crept in, masking fallen columns and crumbling mounds with poisonous green. Here and there buckling towers reeled drunkenly against the morning sky, and broken pillars jutted up among the decaying walls. In the center space, a marble pyramid was spired by a slim column, and on its pinnacle sat or squatted something that Conan supposed to be an image, until his keen eyes detected life in it. "It is a great bird," said one of the warriors standing in the bows. "It is a monster bat," insisted another. "It is an ape," said Belit. Just then the creature spread broad wings and flapped off into the jungle. "A winged ape," said old Nayaga uneasily. "Better we had cut our throats than come to this place. It is haunted." Belit mocked at his superstitions and ordered the galley run inshore and tied to the crumbling wharfs. She was the first to spring ashore, closely followed by Conan, and after them trooped the ebon-skinned pirates, white plumes waving in the morning wind, spears ready, eyes rolling dubiously at the surrounding jungle. Over all brooded a silence as sinister as that of a sleeping serpent. Belit posed picturesquely among the ruins, the vibrant life in her lithe figure contrasting strangely with the desolation and decay about her. The sun flamed up slowly, sullenly above the jungle, flooding the towers with a dull gold that left shadows lurking beneath the tottering walls. Belit pointed to a slim round tower that reeled on its rotting base. A broad expanse of cracked, green-grown slabs led up to it, flanked by fallen columns, and before it stood a massive altar. Belit went swiftly along the ancient floor and stood before it. "This was a temple of the Old Ones," she said. "Look, you can see the channels for the blood along the sides of the altar, and the rains of 10,000 years have not washed the dark stains from them. The walls have all fallen away, but this stone block defies time and the elements." "But who were these Old Ones?" demanded Conan. She spread her slim hands helplessly. "Not even in legend is this city mentioned. But look at the handholds at either side of the altar. Priests often conceal their treasures beneath the altars. 4 of you lay hold and see if you can lift it." She stepped back to make room for them, glancing up at the tower which loomed drunkenly above them. 3 of the strongest blacks had gripped the handholds cut into the stone, curiously unsuited to human hands. When Belit sprang back with a sharp cry, they froze in their places, and Conan, bending to aid them, wheeled with a startled curse. "A snake in the grass," she said, backing away. "Come and slay it. The rest of you bend your backs to the stone." Conan came quickly toward her, another taking his place. As he impatiently scanned the grass for the reptile, the giant blacks braced their feet, grunted, and heaved with their huge muscles, coiling and straining under their ebon skin. The altar did not come off the ground, but it revolved suddenly on its side, and simultaneously there was a grinding rumble above, and the tower came crashing down, covering the 4 black men with broken masonry. A cry of horror rose from their comrades. Belit's slim figures dug into Conan's arm muscles. "There was no serpent," she whispered. "It was but a ruse to call you away. I feared. The Old Ones guarded their treasure well. Let us clear away the stones." With Herculean effort they did so, and lifted out the mangled bodies of the 4 men. And under them, stained with their blood, the pirates found a crypt carved in the solid stone. The altar, hinged curiously with stone rods and sockets on one side, had served as its lid. And at first glance the crypt seemed brimming with liquid fire, catching the early light with a million blazing facets. Undreamable wealth lay before the eyes of the gaping pirates. Diamonds, rubies, bloodstones, sapphires, turquoises, moonstones, opals, emeralds, amethysts, unknown gems that shone like the eyes of evil women. The crypt was filled to the brim with bright stones that the morning sun struck into lambent flame. With a cry, Belit dropped to her knees among the blood-stained rubble on the brink and thrust her white arms shoulder-deep into that pool of splendor. She withdrew them, clutching something that brought up another cry to her lips. A long string of crimson stones that were like clots of frozen blood strung on a thick gold wire. In their glow, the golden sunlight changed to bloody haze. Belit's eyes were like a woman's in a trance. The Shemite soul finds a bright drunkenness in riches and material splendor, and the sight of this treasure might have shaken the soul of a sated emperor of Sushan. "Take up the jewels, dogs!" Her voice was shrill with her emotions. "Look!" A muscular black arm stabbed toward the tigress, and Belit wheeled, her crimson lips asnarl, as she expected to see a rival corsairs sweeping in to despoil her of her plunder. But from the gunwales of the ship a dark shape rose, soaring away over the jungle. "The devil ape has been investigating the ship," muttered the blacks uneasily. "What matter?" cried Belit with a curse, raking back a rebellious lock with an impatient hand. "Make a litter of spears and mantles to bear these jewels. Where the devil are you going?" "To look to the galley," grunted Conan. "That bat thing might have knocked a hole in the bottom for all we know." He ran swiftly down the cracked wharf and sprang aboard. A moment's swift examination below decks, and he swore heartily, casting a clouded glance in the direction the bat being had vanished. He returned hastily to Belit, superintending the plunder of the crypt. She had looped the necklace about her neck, and on her naked white bosom the red clots glimmered darkly. A huge naked black stood crotch-deep in the jewel-brimming crypt, scooping up great handfuls of splendor to pass them to eager hands above. Strings of frozen iridescence hung between his dusky fingers. Drops of red fire dripped from his hands, piled high with starlight and rainbow. It was as if a black titan stood straddle-legged in the bright pits of hell, his lifted hands full of stars. "That flying devil has staved in the water casks," said Conan. "If we hadn't been so dazed by these stones, we'd have heard the noise. We were fools not to have left a man on guard. We can't drink this river water. I'll take 20 men and search for fresh water in the jungle." She looked at him vaguely, in her eyes the blank blaze of her strange passion, her fingers working at the gems on her breast. "Very well," she said absently, hardly heeding him. "I'll get the loot aboard." The jungle closed quickly about them, changing the light from gold to gray. From the arching green branches, creepers dangled like pythons. The warriors fell into single file, creeping through the primordial twilights like black phantoms following a white ghost. Underbrush was not so thick as Conan had anticipated. The ground was spongy but not slushy. Away from the river it sloped gradually upward. Deeper and deeper they plunged into the green, waving depths, and still there was no sign of water, either running stream or stagnant pool. Conan halted suddenly, his warriors freezing into basaltic statues. In the tense silence that followed, the Cimmerian shook his head irritably. "Go ahead," he grunted to a sub-chief, Nagora. "March straight on till you can no longer see me. Then stop and wait for me. I believe we're being followed. I heard something." The blacks shuffled their feet uneasily, but did as they were told. As they swung onward, Conan stepped quickly behind a great tree, glaring back along the way they had come. From that leafy fastness anything might emerge. Nothing occurred. The faint sounds of the marching spearmen faded into the distance. Conan suddenly realized that the air was impregnated with an alien and exotic scent. Something gently brushed his temple. He turned quickly. From a cluster of green, curiously leafed stalks, great black blossoms nodded at him. One of these had touched him. They seemed to beckon him, to arch their pliant stems toward him. They spread and rustled, though no wind blew. He recoiled, recognizing the black lotus whose juice was death and whose scent brought dream-haunted slumber. But already he felt a subtle lethargy stealing over him. He sought to lift his sword, to hew down the serpentine stalks, but his arm hung lifeless at his side. He opened his mouth to shout to his warriors, but only a faint rattle issued. The next instant, with appalling suddenness, the jungle waved and dimmed out before his eyes. He did not hear the screams that burst out awfully not far away as his knees collapsed, letting him pitch limply to the earth. Above his prostrate form, the great black blossoms nodded in the windless air. 3. The Horror in the Jungle. Was it a dream the nighted lotus brought? Then cursed the dream that brought my sluggish life, and cursed each laggard hour that does not see hot blood drip blackly from the crimsoned knife. The Song of Belit. First there was the blackness of an utter void, with the cold winds of cosmic space blowing through it. Then shapes, vague, monstrous, and evanescent, rolled in dim panorama through the expanse of nothingness, as if the darkness were taking material form. The winds blew, and a vortex formed, a whirling pyramid of roaring blackness. From it grew shape and dimension. Then, suddenly, like clouds dispersing, the darkness rolled away on either hand, and a huge city of dark green stone rose on the bank of a wide river, flowing through an illimitable plain. Through this city moved beings of alien configuration. Cast in the mold of humanity, they were distinctly not men. They were winged and of heroic proportions, not a branch on the mysterious stalk of evolution that culminated in man, but the ripe blossom on an alien tree, separate and apart from that stalk. Aside from their wings, in physical appearance they resembled man only as man in his highest form resembles the great apes. In spiritual, aesthetic, and intellectual development, they were superior to man as man is superior to the gorilla. But when they reared their colossal city, Man's primal ancestors had not yet risen from the slime of the primordial seas. These beings were mortal, as are all things built of flesh and blood. They lived, loved, and died, though the individual span of life was enormous. Then, after uncounted millions of years, the change began. The vista shimmered and waved like a picture thrown on a wind-blown curtain. Over the city and the land the ages flowed as waves flow over a beach, and each wave brought alterations. Somewhere on the planet the magnetic centers were shifting. The great glaciers and ice fields were withdrawing toward the new poles. The littoral of the great river altered. Plains turned into swamps that stank with reptilian life. Where fertile meadows had rolled, forests reared up, growing into dank jungles. The changing ages wrought on the inhabitants of the city as well. They did not migrate to fresher lands. Reasons inexplicable to humanity held them to the ancient city and their doom. And as that once rich and mighty land sank deeper and deeper into the black mire of the sunless jungle, so into the chaos of squalling jungle life sank the people of the city. Terrific convulsion shook the earth. The nights were lurid with spouting volcanoes that fringed the dark horizons with red pillars. After an earthquake that shook down the outer walls and the highest towers of the city, and caused the river to run black for days with some lethal substance spewed up from the subterranean depths, a frightful chemical change became apparent in the waters the folk had drunk for millenniums uncountable. Many died who drank of it, and in those who lived, the drinking wrought change, subtle, gradual, and grisly. In adapting themselves to the changing conditions, they had sunk far below their original level, but the lethal waters altered them even more horribly, from generation to more bestial generation. They who had been winged gods became pinioned demons, and all that remained of their ancestors' vast knowledge distorted and perverted and twisted into ghastly paths. As they had risen higher than mankind might dream, so they sank lower than man's maddest nightmares reach. They died fast, by cannibalism and horrible feuds fought out in the murk of the midnight jungle, and at last, among the lichen-grown ruins of their city, only a single shape lurked, the stunted, abhorrent perversion of nature. Then, for the first time, humans appeared, dark-skinned, hawk-faced men in copper and leather harness, bearing bows, the warriors of prehistoric Stygia. There were only 50 of them, and they were haggard and gaunt with starvation and prolonged effort, stained and scratched with jungle wandering, with blood-crusted bandages that told of fierce fighting. In their minds was a tale of warfare and defeat, and flight before a stronger tribe which drove them ever southward until they lost themselves in the green ocean of jungle and river. Exhausted, they lay down among the ruins where red blossoms that bloom but once in a century waved in the full moon, and sleep fell upon them. And as they slept, a hideous shape crept red-eyed from the shadows and performed weird and awful rites about and above each sleeper. The moon hung in the shadowy sky, painting the jungle red and black. Above the sleepers glimmered the crimson blossoms, like splashes of blood. Then the moon went down, and the eyes of the necromancer were red jewels set in the ebony of night. When dawn spread its white veil over the river, there were no men to be seen, only a hairy, winged horror that squatted in the center of a ring of 50 great spotted hyenas that pointed quivering muzzles to the ghastly sky and howled like souls in hell. Then scene followed scene so swiftly that each tripped over the heels of its predecessor. There was a confusion of movement, a writhing and melting of lights and shadows against a background of black jungle, green stone ruins, and murky river. Black men came up to the river in long boats with skulls grinning on the prows, or stole stooping through the trees, spear in hand. They fled screaming through the dark from red eyes and slavering fangs. Howls of dying men shook the shadows. Stealthy feet padded through the gloom. Vampire eyes blazed redly. There were grisly feasts beneath the moon, across whose red disk a bat-like shadow incessantly swept. Then, abruptly, etched clearly in contrast to these impressionistic glimpses, around the jungled point in the whitening dawn swept a long galley, thronged with shining ebon figures, and in the bow stood a white-skinned ghost in blue steel. It was at this point that Conan first realized that he was dreaming. Until that instant he had no consciousness of individual existence, but as he saw himself treading the boards of the Tigris, he recognized both the existence and the dream, although he did not awaken. Even as he wondered, the scene shifted abruptly to a jungle glade where Angora and 19 black spearmen stood as if awaiting someone. Even as he realized that it was he for whom they waited, a horror swooped down from the skies, and their stolidity was broken by yells of fear. Like men maddened by terror, they threw away their weapons and raced wildly through the jungle, pressed close to the slavering monstrosity that flapped its wings above them. Chaos and confusion followed this vision, during which Conan feebly struggled to awake. Dimly he seemed to see himself lying under a nodding cluster of black blossoms, while from the bushes a hideous shape crept toward him. With a savage effort he broke the unseen bonds which held him to his dreams and started upright. Bewilderment was in the glare he cast about him. Near him swayed the dusky lotus, and he hastened to draw away from it. In the spongy soil nearby there was a track, as if an animal had put out a foot, preparatory to emerging from the bushes, then had withdrawn it. It looked like the spoor of an unbelievably large hyena. He yelled for Angora. Primordial silence brooded over the jungle, in which his yell sounded brittle and hollow as mockery. He could not see the sun, but his wilderness-trained instinct told him the day was near its end. A panic rose in him at the thought that he had lain senseless for hours. He hastily followed the tracks of the spearmen, which lay plain in the damp loam before him. They ran in single file, and he soon emerged into a glade, to stop short, the skin crawling between his shoulders as he recognized it as the glade he had seen in his lotus-drugged dream. Shields and spears lay scattered about as if dropped in headlong flight. And from the tracks which led out of the glade and deeper into the fastnesses, Conan knew that the spearmen had fled, wildly. The footprints overlay one another, they weaved blindly among the trees, and with startling suddenness the hastening Cimmerian came out of the jungle and onto a hill-like rock, which sloped steeply, to break off abruptly in a sheer precipice 40 feet high, and something crouched on the brink. At first Conan thought it to be a great black gorilla. Then he saw that it was a giant black man that crouched ape-like, long arms dangling, froth dripping from the loose lips. It was not until, with a sobbing cry, the creature lifted huge hands and rushed toward him, that Conan recognized Angora. The black man gave no heed to Conan's shout as he charged, eyes rolled up to display the white, teeth gleaming, face an inhuman mask. With his skin crawling with the horror that madness always instills in the sane, Conan passed his sword through the black man's body. Then, avoiding the hooked hands that clawed at him as Angora sank down, he strode to the edge of the cliff. For an instant he stood looking down into the jagged rocks below, where lay Angora's spearmen, in limp, distorted attitudes that told of crushed limbs and splintered bones. Not one moved. A cloud of huge black flies buzzed loudly above the blood-splashed stones. The ants had already begun to gnaw at the corpses. On the trees about sat birds of prey, and a jackal, looking up and seeing the men on the cliff, slunk furtively away. For a little space Conan stood motionless. Then he wheeled and ran back the way he had come, flinging himself with reckless haste through the tall grasses and bushes, hurdling creepers that sprawled snake-like across his path. His sword swung low in his right hand, and an unaccustomed pallor tinged his dark face. The silence that reigned in the jungle was not broken. The sun had set, and great shadows rushed upward from the slime of the black earth. Through the gigantic shades of lurking death and grim desolation, Conan was a speeding glimmer of scarlet and blue steel. No sound in all the solitude was heard except his own quick panting as he burst from the shadows into the dim twilight of the river shore. He saw the galley shouldering the rotten wharf, the ruins reeling drunkenly in the grey half-light. And here and there among the stones were spots of raw, bright color, as if a careless hand had splashed with a crimson brush. Again Conan looked on death and destruction. Before him lay his spearmen, nor did they rise to salute him. From the jungle edge to the river bank, among the rotting pillars and along the broken piers they lay, torn and mangled and half-devoured, chewed travesties of men. All about the bodies and pieces of bodies were swarms of huge footprints like those of hyenas. Conan came silently upon the pier, approaching the galley, above whose deck was suspended something that glimmered ivory white in the faint twilight. Speechless, the Cimmerian looked on the queen of the Black Coast as she hung from the yard-arm of her own galley. Between the yard and her white throat stretched a line of crimson clots that shone like blood on the grey light. 4. The attack from the air. The shadows were black around him, the dripping jaws gaped wide, thicker than rain the red drops fell. But my love was fiercer than death's black spell, nor all the iron walls of hell could keep me from his side. The Song of Belit. The jungle was a black colossus that locked the ruin-littered glade in ebon arms. The moon had not risen. The stars were flecks of hot amber in a breathless sky that reeked of death. On the pyramid among the fallen towers sat Conan the Cimmerian like an iron statue, chin propped on massive fists. Out in the black shadows, stealthy feet padded, and red eyes glimmered. The dead lay as they had fallen. But on the deck of the Tigris, on a pyre of broken benches, spear shafts, and leopard skins, lay the queen of the Black Coast in her last sleep, wrapped in Conan's scarlet cloak. Like a true queen she lay, with her plunder heaped high about her, silks, cloth of gold, silver braid, casks of gems and golden coins, silver ingots, jeweled daggers, and teocallis of gold wedges. But of the plunder of the accursed city, only the sullen waters of Zarkeba could tell where Conan had thrown it with a heathen curse. Now he sat grimly on the pyramid, waiting for his unseen foes. The black fury in his soul drove out all fear. What shapes would emerge from the blackness he knew not, nor did he care. He no longer doubted the visions of the Black Lotus. He understood that while waiting for him in the glade, Ngora and his comrades had been terror-stricken by the winged monsters swooping upon them from the sky, and fleeing in blind panic had fallen over the cliff, all except their chief, who had somehow escaped their fate, though not madness. Meanwhile, or immediately after, or perhaps before, the destruction of those on the river bank had been accomplished. Conan did not doubt that the slaughter along the river had been the massacre rather than a battle. Already unmanned by their superstitious fears, the blacks might well have died without striking a blow in their own defense when attacked by their inhuman foes. Why he had been spared so long he did not understand, unless the malign entity which ruled the river meant to keep him alive, to torture him with grief and fear. All pointed to a human or superhuman intelligence. The breaking of the water casks to divide the forces, the driving of the blacks over the cliff, and last and greatest the grim jest of the crimson necklace knotted like a hangman's noose about Balit's white neck. Having apparently saved the Cimmerian for the choicest victim, and extracted the last ounce of exquisite mental torture, it was likely that the unknown enemy would conclude the drama by sending him after the other victims. No smile bent Conan's grim lips at the thought, but his eyes were lit with iron laughter. The moon rose, striking fire from the Cimmerian's horned helmet. No call awoke the echoes, yet suddenly the night grew tense, and the jungle held its breath. Instinctively Conan loosened the great sword in its sheath. A pyramid in which he rested was four-sided, one, the side toward the jungle, carved in broad steps. In his hand was a Shemite bow, such as Balit had taught her pirates to use. A heap of arrows lay at his feet, feathered ends toward him as he rested on one knee. Something moved in the blackness under the trees. Etched abruptly in the rising moon, Conan saw a darkly blocked-out head and shoulders, brutish in outline, and now from the shadows dark shapes came silently, swiftly, running low. 20 great spotted hyenas, their slavering fangs flashed in the moonlight, their eyes blazed as no true beast's eyes ever blazed. 20. Then the spears of the pirates had taken toll of the pack after all. Even as he thought this, Conan drew nock to ear, and at the twang of the string a flame-eyed shadow bounded high and fell writhing. The rest did not falter. On they came, and like a rain of death among them fell the arrows of the Cimmerian, driven with all the force and accuracy of steely thews, backed by a hate hot as the slag heaps of hell. In his berserk fury he did not miss. The air was filled with feathered destruction. The havoc wrought among the onrushing pack was breathtaking. Less than half of them reached the foot of the pyramid. Others dropped upon the broad steps. Glaring down into the blazing eyes, Conan knew these creatures were not beasts. It was not merely in their unnatural size that he sensed a blasphemous difference. They exuded an aura tangible as the black mist rising from a corpse-littered swamp. By what godless alchemy these beings had been brought into existence he could not guess, but he knew he faced diabolism blacker than the well of Skelos. Springing to his feet, he bent his bow powerfully and drove his last shaft point-blank at a great hairy shape that soared up at his throat. The arrow was a flying beam of moonlight that flashed onward with but a blur in its course, but the weir-beast plunged convulsively in mid-air and crashed headlong, shot through and through. Then the rest were on him in a nightmare rush of blazing eyes and dripping fangs. His fiercely driven sword shore the first asunder, then the desperate impact of the others bore him down. He crushed a narrow skull with the pommel of his hilt, feeling the bones splinter and blood and brains gush over his hand. Then, dropping the sword, useless at such deadly close quarters, he caught at the throats of the two horrors which were ripping and tearing at him in silent fury. A foul, acrid scent almost stifled him. His own sweat blinded him. Only his mail saved him from being ripped to ribbons in an instant. The next, his naked right hand locked on a hairy throat and tore it open. His left hand, missing the throat of the other beast, caught and broke its foreleg. A short yelp, the only cry in that grim battle, and hideously human-like, burst from the maimed beast. At the sick horror of that cry from a bestial throat, Conan involuntarily relaxed his grip. One, blood gushing from its torn jugular, lunged at him in a last spasm of ferocity and fastened his fangs on his throat, to fall back dead, even as Conan felt the tearing agony of its grip. The other, springing forward on 3 legs, was slashing at his belly as a wolf slashes, actually rending the links of his mail. Flinging aside the dying beast, Conan grappled the crippled horror, and with a muscular effort that brought a groan from his blood-flecked lips, he heaved upright, gripping the struggling, tearing fiend in his arms. An instant he reeled off balance, its fetid breath hot in his nostrils, its jaws snapping at his neck. Then he hurled it from him to crash with bones splintering force down the marble steps. As he reeled on wide-braced legs, sobbing for breath, the jungle and the moon swimming bloodily onto his sight, the thrash of bat wings was loud in his ears. Stooping, he groped for his sword and, swaying upright, braced his feet drunkenly and heaved the great blade above his head with both hands, shaking the blood from his eyes as he sought the air above him for his foe. Instead of attack from the air, the pyramid staggered suddenly and awfully beneath his feet. He heard a rumbling crackle and saw the tall column above him wave like a wand. Stung to galvanized life, he bounded far out. His feet hit a step halfway down, which rocked beneath him, and his next desperate leap carried him clear. But even as his heels hit the earth, with a shattering crash like a breaking mountain, the pyramid crumbled. The column came thundering down in bursting fragments. For a blind, cataclysmic instant, the sky seemed to rain shards of marble. Then a rubble of shattered stone lay whitely under the moon. Conan stirred, throwing off the splinters that half covered him. A glancing blow had knocked off his helmet and momentarily stunned him. Across his legs lay a great piece of the column, pinning him down. He was not sure that his legs were unbroken. His black locks were plastered with sweat. Blood trickled from his wounds in his throat and hands. He hitched up on one arm, struggling with the debris that prisoned him. Then something swept down across the stars and struck the sward near him. Twisting about, he saw it, the winged one. With fearful speed it was rushing upon him, and in that instant Conan had only a confused impression of a gigantic, man-like shape hurtling along on bowed and stunted legs, of huge, hairy arms outstretching misshapen, black-nailed paws, of a malformed head in whose broad face the only recognizable features as such were a pair of blood-red eyes. It was a thing neither man, beast, nor devil, imbued with characteristics subhuman as well as characteristics superhuman. But Conan had no time for conscious, consecutive thought. He threw himself toward the fallen sword, and his clawing fingers missed it by inches. Desperately he grasped the shard which pinned his legs, and the veins swelled in his temples as he strove to thrust it off him. It gave slowly, but he knew that before he could free himself the monster would be upon him, and he knew that those black-taloned hands were death. The headlong rush of the winged one had not wavered. It towered over the prostrate Cimmerian like a black shadow, arms thrown wide. A glimmer of white flashed between it and its victim. In one mad instant she was there, a tense white shape, vibrant with love, fierce as a she-panther's. The dazed Cimmerian saw between him and the onrushing death her lithe figure shimmering like ivory beneath the moon. He saw the blaze of her dark eyes, the thick cluster of her burnished hair. Her bosom heaved, her red lips were parted. She cried out sharp and ringing at the ring of steel as she thrust at the winged monster's breast. "Belit!" screamed Conan. She flashed a quick glance at him, and in her dark eyes he saw her love flaming, a naked elemental thing of raw fire and molten lava. Then she was gone, and the Cimmerian saw only the winged fiend which had staggered back in unwonted fear, arms lifted as if to fend off attack, and he knew that Belit in truth lay on her pyre on the Tigress's deck. In his ears rang her passionate cry, "Were I still in death, and you fighting for life, I would come back from the abyss." With that terrible cry he heaved upward, hurling the stone aside. The winged one came on again, and Conan sprang to meet it, his veins on fire with madness. The thews started out like cords on his forearms as he swung his great sword, pivoting on his heel with the force of the sweeping arc. Just above the hips it caught the hurtling shape, and the knotted legs fell to one side, the torso another, as the blade sheared clear through its hairy body. Conan stood in the moonlit silence, the dripping sword sagging in his hand, staring down at the remnants of his enemy. The red eyes glared up at him with awful life, then glazed and set. The great hands nodded spasmodically and stiffened, and the oldest race in the world was extinct. Conan lifted his head, mechanically searching for the beast things that had been its slaves and executioners. None met his gaze. The bodies he saw littering the moon-splashed grass were of men, not beasts. Hawk-faced, dark-skinned men, naked, transfixed by arrows or mangled by sword strokes, and they were crumbling into dust before his eyes. Why had not the winged master come to the aid of its slaves when he struggled with them? Had it feared to come within reach of fangs that might turn and rend it? Craft and caution had lurked in that misshapen skull, but had not availed in the end. Turning on his heel, the Cimmerian strode down the rotting wharfs and stepped aboard the galley. A few strokes of his sword cut her adrift, and he went to the sweephead. The Tigris rocked slowly in the sullen water, sliding out sluggishly toward the middle of the river until the broad current caught her. Conan leaned on the sweep, his somber gaze fixed on the cloak-wrapped shape that lay in state on the pyre, the richness of which was equal to the ransom of an empress. 5. The funeral pyre. Now we are done with roaming evermore. No more the oars, the windy harp's refrain, nor crimson pennon frights the dusky shore. Blue girdle of the world, receive again her whom thou gavest me. The Song of Belit. Again dawn tinged the ocean. A redder glow lit the river mouth. Conan of Cimmeria leaned on his great sword upon the white beach, watching the Tigris swinging out on her last voyage. There was no light in his eyes that contemplated the glassy swells. Out of the rolling blue wastes all glory and wonder had gone. A fierce revulsion shook him as he gazed at the green surges that deepened into purple hazes of mystery. Belit had been of the sea. She had lent it splendor and allure. Without her it rolled, a barren, dreary, and desolate waste from pole to pole. She belonged to the sea. To its everlasting mystery he returned her. He could do no more. For himself, its glittering blue splendor was more repellent than the leafy fronds which rustled and whispered behind him of vast mysterious wilds beyond them, and into which he must plunge. No hand was at the sweep of the Tigris. No oars drove her through the green water. But a clean, tanging wind bellied her silken sail, and as a wild swan cleaves the sky to her nest, she sped seaward, flames mounting higher and higher from her deck to lick at the mast and envelop the figure that lay lapped in scarlet on the shining pyre. So passed the queen of the Black Coast, and leaning on his red-stained sword, Conan stood silently until the red glow had faded far out in the blue hazes, and dawn splashed its rose and gold over the ocean. The end of Queen of the Black Coast by Robert E. Howard. Recorded by Terry Cronin. www.terrycronin.com.
Rattle of Bones by Robert E. Howard. Landlord, ho! The shout broke the lowering silence and reverberated through the black forest with sinister echoing. This place hath a forbidding aspect, meseemeth. 2 men stood in front of the forest tavern. The building was low, long, and rambling, built of heavy logs. Its small windows were heavily barred, and the door was closed. Above the door its sinister sign showed faintly, a cleft skull. This door swung slowly open, and a bearded face peered out. The owner of the face stepped back and motioned his guests to enter, with a grudging gesture, it seemed. A candle gleamed on a table. A flame smoldered in the fireplace. "Your names?" "Solomon Kane," said the taller man briefly. "Gaston Larmont," the other spoke curtly. "But what is that to you?" "Strangers are few in the Black Forest," grunted the host. "Bandits many. Sit at yonder table, and I will bring food." The 2 men sat down, with the bearing of men who have traveled far. One was a tall, gaunt man, clad in a featherless hat and somber black garments, which set off the dark pallor of his forbidding face. The other was of a different type entirely, bedecked with lace and plumes, although his finery was somewhat stained from travel. He was handsome in a bold way, and his restless eyes shifted from side to side, never still an instant. The host brought wine and food to the rough-hewn table, and then stood back in the shadows, like a somber image. His features, now receding into vagueness, now luridly etched in the firelight as it leapt and flickered, were masked in a beard which seemed almost animal-like in thickness. A great nose curved above this beard, and 2 small red eyes stared unblinkingly at his guests. "Who are you?" suddenly asked the younger man. "I am the host of the Cleft Skull Tavern," sullenly replied the other. His tone seemed to challenge his questioner to ask further. "Do you have many guests?" Larmont pursued. "Few come twice," the host grunted. Kane started and glanced up straight into those small red eyes, as if he sought for some hidden meaning in the host's words. The flaming eyes seemed to dilate, then dropped sullenly before the Englishman's cold stare. "I'm for bed," said Kane abruptly, bringing his meal to a close. "I must take up my journey by daylight." "And I," added the Frenchman. "Host, show us to our chambers." Black shadows wavered on the wall as the two followed their silent host down a long, dark hall. The stocky, broad body of their guide seemed to grow and expand in the light of the small candle which he carried, throwing a long, grim shadow behind him. At a certain door he halted, indicating that they were to sleep there. They entered. The host lit a candle with the one he carried, then lurched back the way he had come. In the chamber the two men glanced at each other. The only furnishings of the room were a couple of bunks, a chair or two, and a heavy table. "Let us see if there be any way to make fast the door," said Kane. "I like not the looks of mine host." "There are racks on the door and jamb for a bar," said Gaston, "but no bar." "We might break up the table and use its pieces for a bar," mused Kane. "Mon Dieu," said Laurent, "you are timorous, monsieur." Kane scowled. "I like not being murdered in my sleep," he answered gruffly. "My faith," the Frenchman laughed, "we are chance met. Until I overtook you on the forest road an hour before sunset, we had never seen each other." "I have seen you somewhere before," answered Kane, "though I cannot now recall where. As for the other, I assume every man is an honest fellow, until he shows me he is a rogue. Moreover, I am a light sleeper, and slumber with a pistol at hand." The Frenchman laughed. "I was wondering how monsieur could bring himself to sleep in the room with a stranger. Ha ha! All right, monsieur Englishman. Let us go forth and take a bar from one of the other rooms." Taking the candle with them, they went into the corridor. Utter silence reigned, and the small candle twinkled redly and evilly in the thick darkness. "Mine host hath neither guests nor servants," muttered Solomon Kane. "A strange tavern. What is the name now? These German words come not easily to me. The Cleft Skull? A bloody name, i' faith." They tried the rooms next to theirs, but no bar rewarded their search. At last they came to the last room at the end of the corridor. They entered. It was furnished like the rest, except that the door was provided with a small barred opening, and fastened from the outside with a heavy bolt, which was secured at one end to the door jamb. They raised the bolt and looked in. "There should be an outer window, but there is not," muttered Kane. "Look!" The floor was stained darkly. The walls and the one bunk were hacked in places, great splinters having been torn away. "Men have died in here," said Kane somberly. "Is yonder not a bar fixed in the wall?" "Aye, but 'tis made fast," said the Frenchman, tugging at it. A section of the wall swung back, and Gaston gave a quick exclamation. A small secret room was revealed, and the two men bent over the grisly thing that lay upon its floor. "The skeleton of a man," said Gaston. "And behold, how his bony leg is shackled to the floor. He was imprisoned here and died." "Nay," said Kane, "the skull is cleft. Methinks mine host had a grim reason for the name of his hellish tavern. This man, like us, was no doubt a wanderer who fell into the fiend's hands." "Likely," said Gaston without interest. He was engaged in idly working the great iron ring from the skeleton's leg bones. Failing in this, he drew his sword, and with an exhibition of remarkable strength, cut the chain which joined the ring on the leg to a ring set deep in the log floor. "Why should he shackle a skeleton to the floor?" mused the Frenchman. "Mon bleu, 'tis a waste of good chain. Now, monsieur," he ironically addressed the white heap of bones, "I have freed you, and you may go where you like." "Have done," Kane's voice was deep. "No good will come of mocking the dead." "The dead should defend themselves," laughed Laurent. "Somehow I will slay the man who kills me, though my corpse climb up 40 fathoms of ocean to do it." Kane turned toward the outer door, closing the door of the secret room behind him. He liked not this talk which smacked of demonry and witchcraft, and he was in haste to face the host with the charge of his guilt. As he turned, with his back to the Frenchman, he felt the touch of cold steel against his neck, and knew that a pistol muzzle was pressed close beneath the base of his brain. "Move not, monsieur," the voice was low and silky. "Move not, or I will scatter your few brains over the room." The Puritan, raging inwardly, stood with his hands in the air, while Armand slipped his pistols and sword from their sheaths. "Now you can turn," said Gaston, stepping back. Kane bent a grim eye on the dapper fellow, who stood bareheaded now, hat in one hand, the other hand leveling his long pistol. "Gaston the Butcher," said the Englishman somberly. "Fool that I was to trust a Frenchman. You range far, murderer. I remember you now, with that cursed great hat off. I saw you in Calais some years agone." "Aye, and now you will see me never again. What was that? Rats exploring yon skeleton, said Kane, watching the bandit like a hawk, waiting for a single slight wavering of that black gun muzzle. The sound was of the rattle of bones. Like enough, returned the other. Now, Monsieur Kane, I know you carry considerable money on your person. I had thought to wait until you slept and then slay you, but the opportunity presented itself, and I took it. You trick easily. I had little thought that I should fear a man with whom I had broken bread, said Kane, a deep timbre of slow fury sounding in his voice. The bandit laughed cynically. His eyes narrowed as he began to back slowly toward the outer door. Kane's sinews tensed involuntarily. He gathered himself like a giant wolf about to launch himself in a death leap, but Gaston's hand was like a rock, and the pistol never trembled. "We will have no death plunges after the shot," said Gaston. "Stand still, monsieur. I have seen men killed by dying men, and I wish to have distance enough between us to preclude that possibility. My faith, I will shoot, you will roar and charge, but you will die before you reach me with your bare hands. And mine host will have another skeleton in his secret niche. That is, if I do not kill him myself. The fool knows me not, nor I him. Moreover—" The Frenchman was in the doorway now, sighting along the barrel. The candle, which had been stuck in a niche on the wall, shed a weird flickering light which did not extend past the doorway. And with the suddenness of death, from the darkness behind Gaston's back, a broad, vague form rose up, and a gleaming blade swept down. The Frenchman went to his knees like a butchered ox, his brains spilling from his cleft skull. Above him towered the figure of the host, a wild and terrible spectacle, still holding the hanger with which he had slain the bandit. "Ho, ho!" he roared. "Back!" Kane had leapt forward as Gaston fell, but the host thrust into his very face a long pistol which he held in his left hand. "Back!" he repeated, in a tigerish roar, and Kane retreated from the menacing weapon and the insanity in the red eyes. The Englishman stood silent, his flesh crawling as he sensed a deeper and more hideous threat than the Frenchman had offered. There was something inhuman about this man, who now swayed to and fro like some great forest beast, while his mirthless laughter boomed out again. "Gaston the Butcher!" he shouted, kicking the corpse at his feet. "Ho, ho! My fine brigand will hunt no more. I had heard of this fool who roamed the Black Forest. He wished gold, and he found death. Now your gold shall be mine, and more than gold, vengeance." "I am no foe of yours," Kane spoke calmly. "All men are my foes. Look, the marks on my wrists. See, the marks on my ankles, and deep in my back, the kiss of the knout. And deep in my brain, the wounds of the years of the cold, silent cells where I lay as punishment for a crime I never committed." The voice broke in a hideous, grotesque sob. Kane made no answer. This man was not the first he had seen whose brain had shattered amid the horrors of the terrible continental prisons. "But I escaped," the scream rose triumphantly. "And here I make war on all men." What was that? Did Kane see a flash of fear in those hideous eyes? "My sorcerer is rattling his bones," whispered the host, then laughed wildly. "Dying, he swore his very bones would weave a net of death for me. I shackled his corpse to the floor, and now, deep in the night, I hear his bare skeleton clash and rattle as he seeks to be free, and I laugh! Ho, ho! How he yearns to rise and stalk like old King Death along these dark corridors when I sleep, to slay me in my bed." Suddenly the insane eyes flared hideously. "You were in that secret room, you and this dead fool. Did he talk to you?" Kane shuddered in spite of himself. Was it insanity, or did he actually hear the faint rattle of bones, as if the skeleton had moved slightly? Kane shrugged his shoulders. Rats will even tug at dusty bones. The host was laughing again. He sidled around Kane, keeping the Englishman always covered, and with his free hand opened the door. All was darkness within, so that Kane could not even see the glimmer of the bones on the floor. "All men are my foes," mumbled the host, in the incoherent manner of the insane. "Why should I spare any man? Who lifted a hand to my aid when I lay for years in the vile dungeons of Karlsruhe? And for a deed never proven. Something happened to my brain then. I became as a wolf, a brother to these of the Black Forest, to which I fled when I escaped. They have feasted, my brothers, on all who lay in my tavern. All except this one, who now clashes his bones, this magician from Russia. lest he come stalking back through the black shadows when night is over the world, and slay me. For who may slay the dead? I stripped his bones and shackled him. His sorcery was not powerful enough to save him from me, but all men know that a dead magician is more evil than a living one. Move not, Englishman. Your bones I shall leave in this secret room beside this one, too. The maniac was standing partly in the doorway of the secret room now, his weapon still menacing Kane. Suddenly he seemed to topple backward and vanished in the darkness, and at the same instant a vagrant gust of wind swept down the outer corridor and slammed the door shut behind him. The candle on the wall flickered and went out. Kane's groping hands, sweeping over the floor, found a pistol, and he straightened, facing the door where the maniac had vanished. He stood in the utter darkness, his blood freezing, while a hideous muffled screaming came from the secret room, intermingled with the dry, grisly rattle of fleshless bones. Then silence fell. Kane found flint and steel and lighted the candle. Then, holding it in one hand and the pistol in the other, he opened the secret door. "Great God!" he muttered, as cold sweat formed on his body. "This thing is beyond all reason, yet with mine own eyes I see it. 2 vows have here been kept, for Gaston the Butcher swore that even in death he would avenge his slaying, and his was the hand which set yon fleshless monster free. And he—" The host of the cleft skull lay lifeless on the floor of the secret room, his bestial face set in lines of terrible fear, and deep in his broken neck were sunk the bare finger bones of the sorcerer's skeleton. End of Rattle of Bones by Robert E. Howard.
The Hyborian Age by Robert E. Howard. Nothing in this article is to be considered as an attempt to advance any theory in opposition to accepted history. It is simply a fictional background for a series of fiction stories. When I began writing the Conan stories a few years ago, I prepared this history of his age and the peoples of that age in order to lend him and his sagas a greater aspect of realness. I found that by adhering to the facts and spirit of that history in writing the stories, it was easier to visualize and therefore to present him as a real flesh-and-blood character rather than a ready-made product. In writing about him and his adventures in the various kingdoms of his age, I have never violated the facts or spirit of the history here set down, but have followed the lines of the history as closely as the writer of actual historical fiction follows the lines of actual history. I have used this history as a guide in all the stories in this series that I have written. Of that epoch, known by the Numidian chroniclers as the pre-cataclysmic age, little is known except the latter part, and that is veiled in the mists of legendary. Known history begins with the wanings of the pre-cataclysmic civilization, dominated by the kingdoms of Camellia, Velusia, Verulia, Grandar, Thule, and Comoria. These peoples spoke a similar language, arguing a common origin. There were other kingdoms equally civilized, but inhabited by different and apparently older races. The barbarians of that age were the Picts, who lived on islands far out on the western ocean. The Atlanteans, who dwelt on a small continent between the Pictish islands and the main, or Thurian continent, and the Lemurians, who inhabited a chain of large islands in the eastern hemisphere. There were vast regions of unexplored land. The civilized kingdoms, though enormous in extent, occupied a comparatively small portion of the whole planet. Velusia was the westernmost kingdom of the Thurian continent, Grandar the easternmost. East of Grandar, whose people were less highly cultured than those of their kindred kingdoms, stretched a wild and barren expanse of deserts. Among the less arid stretches of desert, in the jungles and among the mountains, lived scattered clans and tribes of primitive savages. Far to the south, there was a mysterious civilization, unconnected with the Thurian culture, and apparently pre-human in its nature. On the far eastern shores of the continent, there lived another race, human but mysterious and non-Thurian, with which the Lemurians, from time to time, came in contact. They apparently came from a shadowy and nameless continent lying somewhere east of the Lemurian islands. The Thurian civilization was crumbling. Their armies were composed largely of barbarian mercenaries. Picts, Atlanteans, and Lemurians were their generals, their statesmen, often their kings. Of the bickerings of the kingdoms, and the wars between Valusia and Camoria, as well as the conquests by which the Atlanteans founded a kingdom on the mainland, there were more legends than accurate history. Then the cataclysm rocked the world. Atlantis and Lemuria sank, and the Pictish islands were heaved up to form the mountain peaks of a new continent. Sections of the Thurian continent vanished under the waves, or sinking, formed great island lakes and seas. Volcanoes broke forth, and terrific earthquakes shook down the shining cities of the empires. Whole nations were blotted out. The barbarians fared a little better than the civilized races. The inhabitants of the Pictish islands were destroyed, but a great colony of them settled along the mountains of Valusia's southern frontier to serve as a buffer against foreign invasion, was untouched. The continental kingdom of the Atlanteans likewise escaped the common ruin, and to it came thousands of their tribesmen in ships from the sinking land. Many Lemurians escaped to the eastern coast of the Thurian continent, which was comparatively untouched. There they were enslaved by the ancient race, which already dwelt there, and their history for thousands of years is a history of brutal servitude. In the western part of the continent, changing conditions created strange forms of plants and animal life. In the western part of the continent, changing conditions created strange forms of plant and animal life. Thick jungles covered the plains, great rivers cut their roads to the sea, wild mountains were heaved up, and lakes covered the ruins of old cities in fertile valleys. To the continental kingdom of the Atlanteans, from sunken areas, swarmed myriads of beasts and savages, ape-men and apes. Forced to battle continually for their lives, they yet managed to retain vestiges of their former state of highly advanced barbarism. Robbed of metals and ores, they became workers in stone like their distant ancestors, and had attained a real artistic level when their struggling culture came into contact with the powerful Pictish nation. The Picts had also reverted to flint, but had advanced more rapidly in the matter of population and war science. They had none of the Atlanteans' artistic nature. They were a ruder, more practical, more prolific race. They left no pictures painted or carved on ivory, as did their enemies, but they left remarkably efficient flint weapons in plenty. These Stone Age kingdoms clashed, and in a series of bloody wars, the outnumbered Atlanteans were hurled back into a state of savagery, and the evolution of the Picts was halted. 500 years after the cataclysm, the barbaric kingdoms have vanished. It is now a nation of savages, the Picts carrying on continual warfare with tribes of savages, the Atlanteans. The Picts had the advantage of numbers and unity, whereas the Atlanteans had fallen into loosely knit clans. That was the West of that day. In the distant east, cut off from the rest of the world by the heaving up of gigantic mountains and the forming of a chain of vast lakes, the Lemurians are toiling as slaves of their ancient masters. The far south is still veiled in mystery. Untouched by the cataclysm, its destiny is still pre-human. Of the civilized races of the Thurian continent, a remnant of one of the non-Valusian nations dwells among the low mountains of the southeast, the Gemri. Here and there about the world are scattered clans of apish savages entirely ignorant of the rise and fall of great civilizations. But in the far north, another people are slowly coming into existence. At the time of the cataclysm, a band of savages, whose development was not much above that of the Neanderthal, fled to the north to escape destruction. They found the snow countries inhabited only by a species of ferocious snow apes, huge, shaggy white animals apparently native to that climate. These they fought and drove beyond the Arctic Circle to perish, as the savages thought. The latter then adapted themselves to the hardy new environment and throve. After the Pictish-Atlantean Wars had destroyed the beginnings of what might have been a new culture, another lesser cataclysm further altered the appearance of the original continent, left a great inland sea where the chain of lakes had been, to further separate west from east, and the attendant earthquakes, floods, and volcanoes completed the ruin of the barbarians which their tribal wars had begun. 1,000 years after the lesser cataclysm, the western world is seen to be a wild country of jungles and lakes and torrential rivers. Among the forest-covered hills of the northwest exist wandering bands of ape men without human speech or the knowledge of fire or the use of implements. They are the descendants of the Atlanteans, sunk back into the squalling chaos of jungle bestiality from which ages ago their ancestors so laboriously crawled. To the southeast dwell scattered clans of degraded, cave-dwelling savages, whose speech is of the most primitive form, yet who still retain the name of Picts, which has come to mean merely a term designating men themselves to distinguish them from the true beasts with which they contend for life and food. It is their only link with their former stage. Neither the squalid Picts nor the apish Atlanteans have any contact with other tribes or peoples. Far to the east, the Lemurians, leveled almost to a bestial plane themselves by the brutishness of their slavery, have risen and destroyed their masters. They are savages stalking among the ruins of a strange civilization. The survivors of that civilization, who have escaped the fury of their slaves, have come westward. They fall upon that mysterious pre-human kingdom of the south and overthrow it, substituting their own culture modified by contact with the older one. The newer kingdom is called Stygia, and remnants of the older nation seemed to have survived, and even been worshipped after the race as a whole had been destroyed. Here and there in the world, small groups of savages are showing signs of an upward trend. These are scattered and unclassified, but in the north, the tribes are growing. These people are called HYBORIANs, or Hybori. Their god was Bori, some great chief whose legend made even more ancient as the king who led them into the north in the day of the great cataclysm, which the tribes remember only in distorted folklore. They have spread over the north and are pushing southward in leisurely treks. So far, they have not come in contact with any other races. Their wars have been with one another. 1,500 years in the North Country have made them a tall, tawny-haired, gray-eyed race, vigorous and warlike, and already exhibiting a well-defined artistry and poetism of nature. They still live mostly by the hunt, but the southern tribes have been raising cattle for some centuries. There is one exception in their so far complete isolation from other races. A wanderer into the far north returned with the news that the supposedly deserted ice wastes were inhabited by an extensive tribe of ape-like men, descended, he swore, from the beasts driven out of the more habitable lands by the ancestors of the Hyborians. He urged that a large war party be sent beyond the Arctic Circle to exterminate these beasts, whom he swore were evolving into true men. He was jeered at, a small band of adventurous young warriors followed him into the north, but none returned. But tribes of the Hyborians were drifting south, and as the population increased, this movement became extensive. The following age was an epoch of wandering and conquest. Across the history of the world, tribes and drifts of tribes move and shift in an ever-changing panorama. Look at the world 500 years later. Tribes of tawny-haired Hyborians have moved southward and westward, conquering and destroying many of the small, unclassified clans. Absorbing the blood of the conquered races, already the descendants of the older drifts have begun to show modified racial traits, and these mixed races are attacked fiercely by new, purer-blooded drifts, and swept before them as a broom sweeps debris impartially, to become even more mixed and mingled in the tangled debris of races and tag-ins of races. As yet the conquerors have not come in contact with the older races. To the southeast, the descendants of the Gemri, given impetus by new blood resulting from admixture with some unclassified tribe, are beginning to seek to revive some faint shadow of their ancient culture. To the west, the apish Atlanteans are beginning the long climb upward. They've completed the cycle of existence. They have long forgotten their former existence as men. Unaware of any other former state, they are starting to climb unhelped and unhindered by human memories. To the south of them, the Picts remain savages, apparently defying the laws of nature by neither progressing nor retrogressing. Far to the south dreams the ancient mysterious kingdom of Stygia. On its eastern borders wander clans of nomadic savages already known as the Sons of Shem. Next to the Picts, in the broad valley of Zing, protected by great mountains, a nameless band of primitives, tentatively classified as akin to the Shemites, has evolved an advanced agricultural system and existence. Another factor has added to the impetus of Hyborian drift. A tribe of that race has discovered the use of stone in building, and the first Hyborian kingdom has come into being, the rude and barbaric kingdom of Hyperborea, which had its beginning in a crude fortress of boulders heaped to repel tribal attack. The people of this tribe soon abandoned their horsehide tents for stone houses, crudely but mightily built, and thus protected they grew strong. There are a few more dramatic events in history than the rise of the rude, fierce kingdoms of Hyperborea, whose people turned abruptly from their nomadic life to rear dwellings of naked stone surrounded by cyclopean walls, a race scarcely emerged from the polished Stone Age who had by a freak of chance learned the first rude principles of architecture. The rise of this kingdom drove forth many other tribes, for defeated in the war or refusing to become tributary to their castle-dwelling kinsmen, many clans set forth on long treks that took them halfway around the world, and already the more northern tribes are beginning to be harried by gigantic blonde savages not much more advanced than ape-men. The tale of the next 1,000 years is the tale of the rise of the Hyborians, whose warlike tribes dominate the western world. Rude kingdoms are taking shape. The tawny-haired invaders have encountered the Picts, driving them into the barren lands of the west. To the northwest, the descendants of the Atlanteans, climbed unaided from apedom into primitive savagery, have not yet met the conquerors. Far to the east, the Lemurians are evolving a strange semi-civilization of their own. To the south, the Hyborians have founded the Kingdom of Koth on the borders of those pastoral countries known as the lands of Shem, and the savages of those lands, partly through contact with the Hyborians, partly through the contact with the Stygians, who have ravaged them for centuries, are emerging from barbarism. The blonde savages of the far north have grown in power and numbers, so that the northern Hyborian tribes move southward, driving their kindred clans before them. The ancient kingdom of Hyperborea is overthrown by one of those northern tribes which, however, retains the old name. Southeast of Hyperborea, a kingdom of the Gemri has come into being under the name of Zamora. To the southwest, a tribe of Picts have invaded the fertile valley of Zing, conquered the agricultural people there, and settled among them. This mixed race was in turn conquered later by a roving tribe of Hybori, and from those mingled elements came the kingdom of Zingara. 500 years later, the kingdoms of the world are clearly defined. The kingdom of the Hyborians, Aquilonia, Nemedia, Brethunia, Hyperborea, Koth, Ophir, Argos, Corinthia, and one known as the Border Kingdom, dominate the western world. Zamora lies to the east, and Zingara to the southwest of these kingdoms, people alike in darkness of complexion and exotic habits, but otherwise unrelated. Far to the south sleeps Stygia, untouched by foreign invasion, but the peoples of Shem have exchanged the Stygian yoke for the less galling one of Koth. The dusky masters have been driven south of the great river Styx, Nilus, or Nile, which, flowing north from the shadowy hinterlands, turns almost at right angles and flows almost due west through the pastoral meadowlands of Shem to empty into the great sea. North of Aquilonia, the westernmost Hyborian kingdom, are the Cimmerians, ferocious savages untamed by the invaders, but advancing rapidly because of contact with them. They are the descendants of the Atlanteans, now progressing more steadily than their old enemies the Picts, who dwell in the wilderness west of Aquilonia. Another 5 centuries and the Hybori people are the possessors of a civilization so virile that contact with it virtually snatched out of the wallow of savagery such tribes as it touched. The most powerful kingdom is Aquilonia, but others vie with it in strength and mixed race. The nearest to the ancient root stock are the Gundermen of Gunderland, a northern province of Aquilonia, but this mixing has not weakened the race. They are supreme in the western world, though the barbarians of the wastelands are growing in strength. In the north, golden-haired, blue-eyed barbarians, descendants of the blonde Arctic savages, have driven the remaining Hyborian tribes out of the snow countries, except the ancient kingdom of Hyperborea, which resists their onslaught. Their country is called Nordheim, and they are divided into the red-haired Vanir of Vanaheim and the yellow-haired Aesir of Asgard. Now the Lemurians enter history again as Hyrcanians. Through the centuries they have pushed steadily westward, and now a tribe skirts the southern end of the great inland sea, Vilayet, and establishes the kingdom of Turan on the southwestern shore. Between the inland sea and the eastern borders of the native kingdoms lie vast expanses of steppes, and in the extreme north and extreme south, deserts. The non-Hyrcanian dwellers of these territories are scattered and pastoral, unclassified in the north, Shemetish in the south, aboriginal with a thin strain of Hyborian blood from wandering conquerors. Toward the latter part of the period, other Hyrcanian clans push westward, around the northern extremity of the inland sea, and clash with the eastern outposts of the Hyperboreans. Glance briefly at the peoples of that age. The dominant of Hyborians are no longer uniformly tawny-haired and gray-eyed. They have mixed with other races. There is a strong Shemetish, even a Stygian strain among the peoples of Koth, and to a lesser extent of Argos, while in the case of the latter, admixture with the Zingarans has been more extensive than with the Shemites. The eastern Brythunians have intermarried with the dark-skinned Zamorans, and the people of southern Aquilonia have mixed with the brown Zingarans, until black hair and brown eyes are the dominant type in Poitain, the southernmost province. The ancient kingdom of Hyperborea is more aloof than the others, yet there is an alien blood in plenty of its veins, from the capture of foreign women, Hyrcanians, Asir, and Zamorians. Only in the province of Gunderland, where the people keep no slaves, is the pure Hyborian stock found unblemished. But the barbarians have kept their bloodstream pure. The Cimmerians are tall and powerful, with dark hair and blue or gray eyes. The people of Nordheim are of similar build, but with white skins, blue eyes, and golden or red hair. The Picts are of the same type as they always were, short, very dark, with black eyes and hair. The Hyrcanians are dark and generally tall and slender, though a squat, slant-eyed type is more and more common among them, resulting from mixture with a curious race of intelligent, though stunted aborigines conquered by them among the mountains east of Vilayet, on their westward drift. The Shemites are generally of medium height, though sometimes when mixed with Stygian blood, gigantic, broadly and strongly built, with hook noses, dark eyes, and blue-black hair. The Stygians are tall and well-made, dusky, straight-featured, at least the ruling classes are of that type. The lower classes are a downtrodden mongrel horde, a mixture of Negroid, Stygian, Shemetish, even Hyborian bloods. South of Stygia are the vast black kingdoms of the Amazons, the Cushites, the Atlians, and the hybrid empire of Zimbabwe. Between Aquilonia and the Pictish wilderness lie the Bosonian Marches, peopled by descendants of an aboriginal race, conquered by a tribe of Hyborians early in the first ages of the Hyborian drift. This mixed people never attained the civilization of the purer Hyborians and was pushed by them to the very fringe of the civilized world. The Bosonians are of medium height and complexion, their eyes brown or gray, and they are mesocephalic. They live mainly by agriculture in large walled villages and are part of the Aquilonian kingdoms. Their marches extend from the border kingdom in the north to Zingara in the southwest, forming a bulwark for Aquilonia against both the Cimmerians and the Picts. They are stubborn, defensive fighters, and centuries of warfare against northern and western barbarians have caused them to evolve a type of defense almost impregnable against direct attack. 500 years later, the Hyborian civilization was swept away. Its fall was unique in that it was not brought about by internal decay, but by the growing power of the barbarian nations and the Hyrcanians. The Hyborian peoples were overthrown while their vigorous culture was in its prime. Yet it was Aquilonia's greed which brought about the overthrow, though indirectly. Wishing to extend their empire, her kings made war on their neighbors. Zingara, Argos, and Ophir were annexed outright, with the western cities of Shem, which had, with their more eastern kindred, recently thrown off the yoke of Koth. Koth itself, with Corinthia and the eastern Shemitish tribes, was forced to pay Aquilonia tribute and lend aid in wars. An ancient feud had existed between Aquilonia and Hyperborea, and the latter now marched to meet the armies of her western rival. The plains of the border kingdom were the scene of a great and savage battle, in which the northern hosts were utterly defeated, and retreated into their snowy fastness, whither the victorious Aquilonians did not pursue them. Nemedia, which had successfully resisted the western kingdom for centuries, now drew Brithunia and Zamora, and secretly Koth, into an alliance, which bade fair to crush the rising empire. But before their armies could join the battle, a new enemy appeared, in the east, as the Hyrcanians made their first real thrust at the western world. Reinforced by adventurers from east of Vilayet, the riders of Turin swept over Zamora, devastated eastern Carinthia, and were met on the plains of Brithunia by the Aquilonians, who defeated them and hurled them flying eastward. But the back of the alliance was broken, and Numidia took the defensive in future wars, aided occasionally by Brithunia and Hyperborea, and secretly, as usual, by Koth. This defeat of the Hyrcanians showed the nations the real power of the western kingdom, whose splendid armies were augmented by mercenaries, many of them recruited among the alien Zengarans and the barbaric Picts and Shemites. Zamora was reconquered from the Hyrcanians, but the people discovered that they had merely exchanged an eastern master for a western master. Aquilonian soldiers were quartered there, not only to protect the ravaged country, but also to keep the people in subjection. The Hyrcanians were not convinced. 3 more invasions burst upon the Zamoran borders in the lands of Shem, and were hurled back by the Aquilonians, though the Turanian armies grew larger as hordes of steel-clad riders rode out of the east, skirting the southern extremity of the inland sea. But it was in the west that a power was growing destined to throw down the kings of Aquilonia from their high places. In the north there was incessant bickering along the Cimmerian borders between the black-haired warriors and the Nordhamir, and the Asir, between wars with the Vanir, assailed Hyperborea and pushed back the frontier, destroying city after city. The Cimmerians also fought the Picts and Bossonians impartially, and several times raided into Aquilonia itself, but their wars were less invasions than mere plundering forays. But the Picts were growing amazingly in population and power. By a strange twist of fate, it was largely due to the efforts of one man, and he an alien, that they set their feet upon the ways that led to eventual empire. This man was Aras, a Nemedian priest, a natural-born reformer. What turned his mind toward the Picts is not certain, but this much is history. He determined to go into the western wilderness and modify the rude ways of the heathen by the introduction of the gentle worship of Mitra. He was not daunted by the grisly tales of what had happened to traders and explorers before him, and by some whim of fate he came among the people he sought, alone and unarmed, and was not instantly speared. The Picts had benefited by contact with Hyborian civilization, but they had always fiercely resisted that contact. That is to say, they had learned to work crudely in copper and tin, which were found scantily in their country, and for which later metal they raided into the mountains of Zingara, or traded hides, whale's teeth, walrus tusks, and such few things as savages have to trade. They no longer lived in caves and tree shelters, but built tents of hides and crude huts, copied from those of the Bossonians. They still lived mainly by the chase, since their wilds swarmed with game of all sorts, and the rivers and the sea with fish, but they had learned how to plant grain, which they did sketchily, preferring to steal it from their neighbors, the Bossonians and Zingarans. They dwelt in clans, which were generally at feud with each other, and their simple customs were bloodthirsty and utterly inexplicable to a civilized man, such as Aras of Nemedia. They had no direct contact with the Hyborians, since the Bossonians acted as a buffer between them, but Aras maintained that they were capable of progress, and events proved the truth of his assertion, though scarcely in the way he meant. Aras was fortunate in being thrown in with a chief of more than usual intelligence, Gorm by name. Gorm cannot be explained, any more than Genghis Khan, Othman, Attila, or any of those individuals who, born in naked lands among untutored barbarians, yet possess the instinct for conquest and empire-building. In a sort of bastard Bossonian, the priest made the chief understand his purpose, and, though extremely puzzled, Gorm gave him permission to remain among his tribe unbutchered, a case unique in the history of the race. Having learned the language, Aras set himself to work to eliminate the more unpleasant phases of Pictish life, such as human sacrifice, blood feud, and the burning alive of captives. He harangued Gorm at length, whom he found to be an interested, if unresponsive, listener. Imagination reconstructs the scene, the black-haired chief in his tiger skins and necklace of human teeth, squatting on the dirt floor of the wattle hut, listening intently to the eloquence of the priest, who probably sat on a carven, skin-covered block of mahogany provided in his honor, clad in the silken robes of a Nemedian priest, gesturing with his slender white hands as he expounded the eternal rights and justices which were the truths of Mitra. Doubtless he pointed with repugnance at the rows of skulls which adorned the walls of the hut, and urged Gorm to forgive his enemies instead of putting their bleached remnants to such use. Aris was the highest product of an innately artistic race, refined by centuries of civilization. Gorm had behind him a heritage of 100,000 years of screaming savagery. The pad of the tiger was in the stealthy step, the grip of the gorilla in his black-nailed hands. The fire that burns in a leopard's eye burned in his. Aris was a practical man. He appealed to the savage's sense of material gain. He pointed out the power and splendor of the Hyborian kingdoms as an example of the power of Mitra, whose teachings and works had lifted them up to their high places. And he spoke of cities and fertile plains, marble walls and iron chariots, jeweled towers, and horsemen in their glittering armor riding to battle. And Gorm, with the unerring instinct of the barbarian, passed over his words regarding gods and their teachings and fixed on the material powers thus vividly described. There in that mud-floor wattle hut, with the silk-robed priest on the mahogany block and the dark-skinned chief crouching in his tiger hides, was laid the foundations of an empire. As has been said, Aris was a practical man. He dwelt among the Picts and found much that an intelligent man could do to aid humanity, even when that humanity was cloaked in tiger skins and wore necklaces of human teeth. Like all priests of Mitra, he was instructed in many things. He found that there were vast deposits of iron ore in the Pictish hills, and he taught the natives to mine, smelt, and work it into implements, agricultural implements, as he fondly believed. He instituted other reforms, but these were the most important things he did. He instilled in Gorm a desire to see the civilized lands of the world. He taught the Picts how to work in iron, and he established contact between them and the civilized world. At the chief's request, he conducted him and some of his warriors through the Bosonian marches, where the honest villagers stared in amazement into the glittering outer world. Aris no doubt thought he was making converts right and left, because the Picts listened to him and refrained from smiting him with their copper axes. But the Pict was little calculated to seriously regard teachings which bade him forgive his enemy and abandon the war path for the ways of honest drudgery. It has been said that he lacked artistic sense. His whole nature led to war and slaughter. When the priest talked of the glories of the civilized nations, his dark-skinned listeners were intent, not on the ideals of his religion, but on the loot which he unconsciously described in the narration of rich cities and shining lands. When he told how Mitra aided certain kings to overcome their enemies, they paid scant heed to the miracles of Mitra, but they hung on the description of battle lines, mounted knights, and maneuvers of archery and spearmen. They hearkened with keen, dark eyes and inscrutable countenances, and they went their ways without comment, and heeded, with flattering intentness, his instructions as to the working of iron and kindred arts. Before his coming, they had filched steel weapons and armor from the Bosonians and Zingarans, or had hammered out their own crude armor from copper and bronze. Now a new world opened to them, and the clang of sledges re-echoed throughout the land, and Gorm, by virtue of his new craft, began to assert his dominance over other clans, partly by war, partly by craft and diplomacy, in which latter art he excelled all other barbarians. Picts now came and went freely into Aquilonia, under safe conduct, and they returned with more information as to armor forging and sword-making. More, they entered Aquilonia's mercenary armies, to the unspeakable disgust of the sturdy Bosonians. Aquilonia's kings toyed with the idea of playing the Picts against the Cimmerians, and possibly thus destroying both menaces, but they were too busy with their policies of aggression in the south and east to pay much heed to the vaguely known lands of the west, from which more and more stocky warriors swarmed to take service among the mercenaries. These warriors, their service completed, went back to their wilderness with good ideas of civilized warfare, and that contempt for civilization which arises from familiarity with it. Drums began to beat in the hills, gathering fires smoked on the heights, and savage sword-makers hammered their steel on 1,000 anvils. By intrigues and forays too numerous and devious to enumerate, Gorm became chief of chiefs, the nearest approach to a king the Picts had had in thousands of years. He had waited long. He was past middle age, but now he moved against the frontiers, not in trade, but in war. Aris saw his mistake too late. He had not touched the soul of the pagan, in which lurked the hard fierceness of all the ages. His persuasive eloquence had not caused a ripple in the Pictish conscience. Gorm wore a corselet of silvered mail now, instead of the tiger skin. But underneath he was unchanged. The everlasting barbarian, unmoved by theology or philosophy, his instincts fixed unerringly on rapine and plunder. The Picts burst on the Bossonian frontiers with fire and sword, not clad in tiger skins and brandishing copper axes as of yore, but in scale mail, wielding weapons and keen steel. As for Aris, he was brained by a drunken Pict while making a last effort to undo the work he had unwittingly done. Gorm was not without gratitude. He caused the skull of the slayer to be set on the top of the priest's cairn, and it is one of the grim ironies of the universe that the stones which covered Aris's body should have been adorned with that last touch of barbarity above a man to whom violence and blood vengeance were revolting. But
he could not conquer them. Those had taken the form of wolves. As the ages passed, wolf and demon became merged. No longer could the fiend leave the body of the wolf at will. In many instances, the savagery of the wolf overcame the subtlety of the demon and enslaved him. So the wolf became again only a beast, a fierce, cunning beast, but merely a beast. But of the werewolves, there are many, even yet. And during the time of the full moon, the wolf may take the form or the half-form of a man. When the moon hovers at her zenith, however, the wolf spirit again takes ascendancy, and the werewolf becomes a true wolf once more. But if it is slain in the form of a man, then the spirit is free to haunt its slayer through the ages. Hearken now, I had thought to have slain the thing after it had changed to its true shape, but I slew it an instant too soon. The moon, though it approached the zenith, had not yet reached it, nor had the thing taken on fully the wolf form. Of this I knew nothing, and went my way. But when the next time approached for the full moon, I began to be aware of a strange, malicious influence. An atmosphere of horror hovered in the air, and I was aware of inexplicable, uncanny impulses. One night in a small village in the center of a great forest, the influence came upon me with full power. It was night, and the moon, nearly full, was rising over the forest, and between the moon and me, I saw, floating in the upper air, ghostly and barely discernible, the outline of a wolf's head. I remember little of what happened thereafter. I remember dimly clambering into the silent street, remember struggling, resisting briefly, vainly, and the rest is a crimson maze, until I came to myself the next morning and found my garments and hands caked and stained crimson, and heard the horrified chattering of the villagers, telling me of a pair of clandestine lovers, slaughtered in a ghastly manner, scarcely outside the village, torn to pieces as if by wild beasts, as if by wolves. From that village I fled aghast, but I fled not alone. In the day I could not feel the drive of my fearful captor, but when night fell and the moon rose, I ranged the silent forest, a frightful thing, a slayer of humans, a fiend in a man's body. God, the battles I have fought! But always it overcame me and drove me ravening over some new victim. But after the moon had passed its fullness, the thing's power over me ceased suddenly, nor did it return until 3 nights before the moon was full again. Since then I have roamed the world, fleeing, seeking to escape. Always the thing follows, taking possession of my body when the moon is full. Gods, the frightful deeds I have done! I would have slain myself long ago, but I dare not, for the soul of a suicide is accursed, and my soul would be forever hunted through the flames of hell. And hearken, most frightful of all, my slain body would forever roam the earth, moved and inhabited by the soul of a werewolf. Can any thought be more ghastly? And I seem immune to the weapons of man. Swords have pierced me, daggers have hacked me. I am covered with scars, yet never have they struck me down. In Germany they bound and led me to the block. There would I have willingly placed my head, but the thing came upon me, and breaking my bonds I slew and fled. Up and down the world I have wandered, leaving horror and slaughter in my trail. Chains, cells cannot hold me. The thing is fastened to me through all eternity. In desperation, I accepted Don Vincente's invitation. For look, you, none knows of my frightful double life, since no one could recognize me in the clutch of the demon, and few, seeing me, live to tell of it. My hands are red, my soul doomed to everlasting flames. My mind is torn with remorse for my crimes, and yet I can do nothing to help myself. Surely, Pierre, no man ever knew the hell that I have known. Yes, I slew von Schiller, and I sought to destroy the girl, Margita. Why I did not, I cannot say, for I have slain both women and men. Now, if you will take your sword and slay me, and with my last breath I will give you the good God's blessing. No! You know now my tale, and you see before you a man, fiend-haunted, for all eternity. My mind was spinning with wonderment as I left the room of de Montour. What to do, I knew not. It seemed likely that he would yet murder us all, and yet I could not bring myself to tell Don Vincente all. From the bottom of my soul, I pitied de Montour. So I kept my peace, and in the days that followed, I made occasion to seek him out and converse with him. A real friendship sprang up between us. About this time that black devil, Gola, began to wear an air of suppressed excitement, as if he knew something he wished desperately to tell, but would not, or else dared not. So the days passed in feasting, drinking, and hunting, until one night de Montour came to my chamber and pointed silently at the moon, which was just rising. "Look ye," he said, "I have a plan. I will give it out that I am going into the jungle for hunting, and will go forth, apparently for several days. But at night I will return to the castle, and you must lock me into the dungeon, which is used as a storeroom." This we did, and I managed to slip down twice a day and carry food and drink to my friend. He insisted on remaining in the dungeon even in the day, for though the fiend had never exerted its influence over him in the daytime, and he believed it powerless then, yet he would take no chances. It was during this time that I began to notice that Don Vincente's mink-faced cousin, Carlos, was forcing his attentions upon Isabel, who was his second cousin, and who seemed to resent those attentions. Myself, I would have challenged him for a duel for the toss of a coin, for I despised him, but it was really none of my affair. However, it seemed that Isabel feared him. My friend Luigi, by the way, had become enamored of the dainty Portuguese girl, and was making swift love to her daily. And de Montour sat in his cell and reviewed his ghastly deeds until he battered the bars with his bare hands. And Don Florenzo wandered about the castle grounds like a dour Mephistopheles. And the other guests rode and quarreled and drank. And Gola slithered about, eyeing me if always on the point of imparting momentous information. What wonder if my nerves became rasped to the shrieking point? Each day the natives grew surlier and more sullen and intractable. One night, not long before the full of the moon, I entered the dungeon where de Montour sat. He looked up quickly. "You dare much, coming to me in the night!" I shrugged my shoulders, seating myself. A small barred window let in the night scents and sounds of Africa. "Hark to the native drums," I said. "For the past week they have sounded almost incessantly." De Montour assented. "The natives are restless. Methinks 'tis deviltry they are planning. Have you noticed that Carlos is much among them?" "No," I answered. "But 'tis like there will be a break between him and Luigi. Luigi is paying court to Isabel." So we talked, when suddenly de Montour became silent and moody, answering only in monosyllables. The moon rose and peered in at the barred windows. De Montour's face was illuminated by its beams. And then the hand of horror grasped me. On the wall behind de Montour appeared a shadow clearly defined of a wolf's head. At the same instant, de Montour felt its influence. With a shriek, he bounded from his stool. He pointed fiercely, and as with trembling hands, I slammed and bolted the door behind me. I felt him hurl his weight against it. As I fled up the stairway, I heard a wild raving and battering at the iron-bound door. But with all the werewolf's might, the great door held. As I entered my room, Gola dashed in and gasped out the tale he had been keeping for days. I listened incredulously, and then dashed forth to find Don Vincente. I was told that Carlos had asked him to accompany him to the village to arrange a sale of slaves. My informer was Don Florenzo of Seville, and when I gave him a brief outline of Gola's tale, he accompanied me. Together we dashed through the castle gate, flinging a word to the guards, and down the landing toward the village. Don Vincente, walk with care. Keep sword loosened in its sheath. Fool to walk in the night with Carlos, the traitor. They were nearing the village when we caught up with them. Don Vincente, I exclaimed. Return instantly to the castle. Carlos is selling you into the hands of the natives. Gola has told me that he lusts for your wealth and for Isabel. A terrified native babbled to him of booted footprints near the places where the woodcutters were murdered. And Carlos has made the blacks believe that the slayer was you. Tonight the natives were to rise and slay every man in the castle except Carlos. Do you not believe me, Don Vincente? Is this truth, Carlos? Asked Don Vincente in amaze. Carlos laughed mockingly. The fool speaks truth, he said, but it accomplishes you nothing. Ho! He shouted as he leapt for Don Vincente. Steel flashed in the moonlight, and the Spaniard's sword was through Carlos ere he could move, and the shadows rose about us. Then it was back to back, sword and dagger, 3 men against 100. Spears flashed, and a fiendish yell went up from savage throats. I spitted 3 natives in as many thrusts, and then went down from a stunning swing from a war club, and an instant later Don Vincente fell upon me, with a spear in one arm and another through the leg. Don Florenzo was standing above us, sword leaping like a living thing, when a charge of the arquebusiers swept the riverbank clear, and we were borne into the castle. The black hordes came with a rush, spears flashing like a wave of steel, a thunderous roar of savagery going up to the skies. Time and again they swept up the slopes, bounding the moat, until they were swarming over the palisades. And time and again the fire of the 100-odd defenders hurled them back. They had set fire to the plundered warehouses, and their light vied with the light of the moon. Just across the river there was a larger storehouse, and about this hordes of the natives gathered, tearing it apart for plunder. Would that they would drop torch upon it, said Don Vincente. For naught is stored therein, save for 1,000 pounds of gunpowder. I dare not store the treacherous stuff this side of the river. All the tribes of the river and coast have gathered for our slaughter, and all my ships are upon the seas. We may hold out a while, but eventually they will swarm the palisade and put us to the slaughter." I hastened to the dungeon wherein de Montour sat. Outside the door, I called to him, and he bade me enter in voice, which told me the fiend had left him for an instant. "The blacks have risen," I told him. "I guessed as much. How goes the battle?" I gave him the details of the betrayal and the fight, and mentioned the powder house across the river. He sprang to his feet. "Now by my hag-ridden soul," he exclaimed, "I will fling the dice once more with hell. Swift, let me out of the castle. I will essay to swim the river and set off yon powder." "It is insanity!" I exclaimed. 1,000 blacks lurk between the palisades and the river, and thrice that number beyond. The river itself swarms with crocodiles. "I will attempt it," he answered, a great light in his face. "If I can reach it, some 1,000 natives will lighten the siege. If I am slain, then my soul is free, and mayhap will gain some forgiveness for that I gave my life to atone for my crimes. Then—" "Haste!" he exclaimed, "for the demon is returning. Already I feel his influence. Haste ye!" For the castle gates we sped, and as de Montour ran, he gasped as a man in a terrific battle. At the gate he pitched headlong, then rose to spring through it. Wild yells greeted him from the natives. The arquebusier shouted curses at him and at me. Peering down from the top of the palisades, I saw him turn from side to side uncertainly. A score of natives were rushing recklessly forward, spears raised. Then the eerie wolf yell rose to the skies, and de Montour bounded forward. Aghast, the natives paused, and before a man of them could move, he was among them. Wild shrieks, not of rage, but of terror. In amazement, the arquebusiers held their fire. Straight through the group of blacks de Montour charged, and when they broke and fled, 3 of them fled not. A dozen steps de Montour took in pursuit, then stopped, stock still. A moment he stood so, while spears flew about him, then turned and ran swiftly in the direction of the river. A few steps from the river, another band of blacks barred his way. In the flaming light of the burning houses, the scene was clearly illuminated. A thrown spear tore through de Montour's shoulder. Without pausing in his stride, he tore it forth and drove it through a native, leaping over his body to get among the others. They could not face the fiend-driven white man. With shrieks they fled, and de Montour, bounding upon the back of one, brought him down. Then he rose, staggered, and sprang to the riverbank. An instant he paused there, and then vanished in the shadows. "Name of the devil!" gasped Don Vincente at my shoulder. "What manner of man is that? Was that de Montour?" I nodded. The wild yells of the natives rose above the crackle of the arquebus fire. They were massed thick about the great warehouse across the river. "They plan a great rush," said Don Vincente. "They will swarm clear over the palisade, methinks. Ha!" A crash that seemed to rip the skies apart. A burst of flame that mounted to the stars. The castle rocked with the explosion. Then silence, as the smoke drifting away showed only a great crater where the warehouse had stood. I could tell of how Don Vincente led a charge, crippled as he was, out of the castle gate and down the slope, to fall upon the terrified blacks who had escaped the explosion. I could tell of the slaughter, of the victory and the pursuit of the fleeing natives. I could tell, too, messieurs, of how I became separated from the band and of how I wandered far into the jungle, unable to find my way back to the coast. I could tell how I was captured by a wandering band of slave raiders and of how I escaped. But such is not my intention. In itself it would make a long tale, and it is of de Montour that I am speaking. I thought much of the things that had passed, and wondered if indeed de Montour reached the storehouse to blow it to the skies, or whether it was but the deed of chance. That a man could swim that reptile-swarming river, fiend-driven though he was, seemed impossible. And if he blew up the storehouse, he must have gone up with it. So one night I pushed my way wearily through the jungle and sighted the coast, and close to the shore a small tumble-down hut of thatch. To it I went, thinking to sleep therein if insects and reptiles would allow. I entered the doorway and then stopped short. Upon a makeshift stool sat a man. He looked up as I entered, and the rays of the moon fell across his face. I started back with a ghastly thrill of horror. It was de Montour, and the moon was full. Then as I stood, unable to flee, he rose and came toward me, and his face, though haggard as of a man who had looked into hell, was the face of a sane man. "Come in, my friend," he said, and there was a great peace in his voice. "Come in, and fear me not. The fiend has left me forever." "But tell me, how conquered you?" I exclaimed as I grasped his hand. "I fought a frightful battle as I ran to the river," he answered. "For the fiend had me in its grasp and drove me to fall upon the natives. But for the first time my soul and mind gained ascendancy for an instant just long enough to hold me to my purpose. And I believe the good saints came to my aid, for I was giving my life to save life. I leaped into the river and swam, and in an instant the crocodiles were swarming about me. Again, in the clutch of the fiend, I fought them, there in the river. Then suddenly the thing left me. I climbed from the river and fired the warehouse. The explosion hurled me hundreds of feet, and for days I wandered witless through the jungle. But the full moon came and came again, and I felt not the influence of the fiend. I am free, free!" And a wondrous note of exultation, nay, exaltation, thrilled his words. "My soul is free! Incredible as it seems, the demon lies drowned upon the bed of the river, or else inhabits the body of one of the savage reptiles that swim the ways of the Niger." End of Wolfshead.